Okay, welcome everyone to this Committee of the Whole meeting on Monday, February 22nd. We have a full slate of council here, and we have a number of staff, and I'll let CEO Morris gives a countdown on the attendance of staff.
On Monday, February. Thank you, Mr. Chair. We have many of our staff here this evening. We have Director Manhire, Director Costello, Treasurer Kozil, our Senior Planner Carl Grenke, Jennifer Miller of Economic Development and Tourism. We have Jason Barlow from Water and Wastewater Treatment, and Nadine Bennett, our Deputy Clerk.
Great. Thank you all for coming. Any amendments to the agenda this evening? I believe Deputy Clerk Bennett may have an amendment here.
Yes, with council's permission, there was an item that was added to the agenda twice, so if we could just remove that. So we will remove 8.3 Universal Broadband Fund Report, as it's further down on the agenda as well.
Okay, that'll shorten the night. Any disclosure of monetary issues arising for the agenda this evening? Seeing none. So we have two important delegations this evening, and the first one, I believe, Andrew Marabella is here from Hempson to review draft results of our water and wastewater rate study and financial plans. I want to welcome you, Andrew, to the meeting, and we look forward to hearing what you've got to say.
Great. Thanks for having me, everyone. And the introduction again, my name is Andrew Marabella, Senior Consultant at Hempson. I've been working quite closely with town staff on this particular project over the last several months with the intention of bringing forward to you today a summary of some of the draft results and what the trends we're seeing as it relates to your water and wastewater rates. There is a presentation that I have, and I guess I'll wait a few minutes till it gets up on the screen. I think Nadine might be doing that in the background. There we go. Perfect. So, with that, I have about a 15, hopefully not longer than 20-minute presentation of the overview results. And then we'll be happy to take some questions afterwards. The presentation today is, as I mentioned, a review of the draft, not necessarily any formal recommendations or endorsements of what we have here or the financial plans, but it'll certainly lead into subsequent discussion at the next meeting of council in order to adopt the financial plans as required for your licensed water renewal application. So if we go to the next slide, just to kind of give you a bit of an idea of the study background. So, obviously you can appreciate town has undertaken regular rate reviews to try and ensure costs and revenues kind of match up. When we do the analysis, when we looked at this, currently both the water and the wastewater systems do require a level of tax supported funding in order to be sustainable and in order to ensure the costs are properly recovered by some form of revenues and not all of them being particularly utility rates. The last drinking water system financial plan was completed in January of 2016, and an update to that financial plan is required in order to support the town's license renewal application. So you need to apply for a license renewal every 5 to 6 years, and your license is currently expiring, and a financial plan is one of those requirements. So that kind of triggered and initiated this particular process. The projection of water and wastewater rates that we have identified will effectively underpin the financial plan. Just keeping in mind that the financial plan documents are living documents, they can be amended. So any projections that's within the financial plan can be adjusted as you have been doing, subject to annual capital budget deliberations and changes. But certainly when we do these types of studies, we want to establish a plan and a framework to go forward with, so you can follow the study to as much as possible. And obviously can't forecast COVID type events, but we try and do our best to figure out what will transpire in the municipality over the next 5 to 10 years. If we go to the next slide, just to provide a bit of a background here in terms of what your current water and wastewater rates are, for those who may not be all too familiar with the current structure. Your current structure is pretty common from what we see in other communities. It's differentiated between a charge and a variable charge. Your fixed charge is what we see as your charge per month. and that's based on the meter size. So each charge per month is differentiated by the size of the water meter, and it increases relative to that size. Your consumption charge is broken up between your residential and your non-residential sector. Residentially, the charge is on a flat, constant per cubic meter basis. So depends on how much water you consume, you pay that constant rate per cubic meter for every cubic meter. Non-residentially, the charge differentiated on a declining block structure relative to usage patterns. There's a discount that's effectively put in for consumption over 15,000 cubic meters per month, which really tracks only a select few high volume users in the town, but there is a discounted rate per cubic meter for those users. Again, water and wastewater is the same, obviously with different rates in place for either of them, but the structure itself is similar between the two service categories. So if we move on to the next slide, just to give a bit of an overview of our approach and what we typically do for every rate study, including the towns. You know, the results I'll show is a little bit more simplistic in the sense of providing you with a snapshot of what's occurred. It's quite a bit of a process that goes into kind of coming up to where we've got today with the draft results. We have to do a forecast of future consumption patterns and future connections. That's the starting point. We analyze the trends that's occurred in the town over the previous years. Then that helps inform how things are going to change in a consumption-based component as well as the connection standpoint going forward. We take a quite a close look at the cost, both operational and capital. And capital, particularly for the town, we look at it also in growth and a non-growth perspective. You have historically employed development charges, but that is something that the town is certainly considering. And we have built into this analysis what required to be from a DC perspective, from a growth related perspective, to help absorb some of those costs that the town is going to be incurring over the next 5 to 10 years. We also did look at other non-user rate revenues, so any revenues that come in that help offset the cost of providing services, those are off. And we have the floating box there on the left is what we call as our capital asset life cycle. So any contributions or requirements that we should be putting away to reserve to help fund the future replacement of infrastructure, kind of well outside this planning period, we take a look at what that infrastructure requirements are and smooth them in contributions to reserve to help save for some of those assets down the line. Recognizing that even though we put it into the calculation, doesn't rep the total, a big number in terms of the grand scheme of what your total costs are. Most of them identified by in-year capital, in-year operating costs. And then once we've kind of tallied up those two different components, we have our net rate funding requirement, which identifies the total cost of providing service and what needs to be funded from both the water and the wastewater rates. So relative to the cost and over the consumption and the growth requirements, gives us our rates, both water and wastewater. So if we go to the next slide, talk a little bit about that rate setting approach in the context of the town. We talk about full operating costs and full recovery of them. We based the information on the town's 2020 budget. We started this process kind of mid to late last year. And we adjusted for the accounts of inflation for certain cost centers, and cost centers got different inflationary measures. Things such as utilities and hydro typically increase at a much higher rate than the rate of inflation. So we've made some adjustments in the modeling for that. Obviously, the costs are treated independently between your water and your wastewater service. And we've continued to assume that there's a relative portion of your tax funding is going to be required to continue to recover the full cost of providing services. If we were to remove the tax supported element, it would pretty much create very significant increase in your water and wastewater costs, which would be, in our view, potentially unsustainable from at least a rate shock perspective in year one. We try to recognize that tax supported funding share is going to continue, but we are going to try and continue to kind of dwindle it down and phase it out over the planning period. But recognize that even still at the end of the 10-year period, it still will be as a significant component. The second component here is your recovery of annual capital needs. We've identified an in-year capital requirements based on the 10-year plan provided by staff. There's a significant share of capital that needs to be done over the planning period. But we did try and share the project costs, which we've identified as potentially to be funded from growth, i.e. development charges, and not recover the utility rate. So recognizing there is going to be a level of funding from other funding sources in here. Inclusive of that is debt financing, which we would just smooth out the program. Again, those are the decisions that as the project comes up and the funding considerations need to be discussed at the council floor. But from a modeling perspective, in order to carry out the plan as it is, there needs to be some other funding sources except from the rates in order to smooth out that capital over the planning period. And then the third component is a provision for asset repair and replacement, trying to contribute some monies to reserves so that we do have some stability in our rate requirements each year, and we have sufficient monies to draw on if unforeseen works beyond what we've already identified does come up. So if we go to the next slide, I did want to touch a little bit upon the demand side of things, and both on a consumption side. And this tracks the billed water consumption in the town since 2008. And interestingly, you know, I think the first big thing that you might notice is your gold line there, your non-residential activity has declined substantially from 2008 to 2009 and has continued to decline since then. You know, 08 or 09 recessionary times, some loss of businesses significantly, particularly impacted the town. And that trend has continued to decline, but has stabilized in more recent years. Residentially, the green line has continued to decline. And even with the addition of new residential units that have come online over the last 10 years, that decline has continued to persist. And that's not uncommon from what we see in most other Ontario communities and really other North American communities, as per capita volume trends and consumption trends have continued to decline. As households have gotten smaller, the appliances have become more efficient, very specific metrics which have kind of attributed to that decline. But even on the residential side, that decline has begun to moderate again in the last couple of years. What we have after 2020 and after the black line in purple and red is the Hempson forecast. So it's very tough to, you know, predict peaks and valleys of consumption trends, but generally speaking, we wanted to continue on what that conservation element is and the declining consumption trends over the period. Both residentially and non-residentially, we've continued to decline, but at a bit of a more of a modest pace than what we've seen over the last several years. And part of that is a continuation that residentially we continue to get more units, but there's also going to continue to be conservation trends within that community, within your existing place, that'll continue to decline consumption. So a bit of a technical slide here, but I think it's very important when we're looking at rates. Just as we do have more growth or more connections, that doesn't always necessarily translate into new consumption and new revenue areas. The trends within your existing base continue downward trend, and we do want to make sure that we properly reflect what we think might happen from a consumption standpoint. So moving on to the next slide, just wanted to provide a bit of an overview of the 10-year non-growth related capital requirements. And this plan effectively looks at obviously funding both water and wastewater, what the cap requirements are. Water side of the equation has a pretty significant capital, both in 2024 and 2025. The water tower and distribution trunk upgrade is really what's driving those two particular years of kind of $4 and $5 million worth of capital works. Recognizing that we've only included a small share from DC, but some share of that is still going to come from development charges. But overall, per annum, it's about $2.1 million worth of capital between your water and wastewater system, which is higher than historically what you've been funding from a capital-related perspective each year. But I do got to give credit to town staff. They've gone ahead and really looked at a very detailed and robust capital program of what they think is going to be required over the planning period, which helps inform this and helps inform the rate calculations that we're seeing. So moving on to the next slide, just as an overview of the costing analysis and the cost summary here. So how much revenue needs to be collected from the water rates? I'll go through this graph in a little bit of detail. The wastewater one is virtually a replica of it, but anything above zero represents a cost, and everything below zero obviously represents a revenue that's coming in. So the green bar represents your operating expenditures. Your gold is your capital program, non-growth related, and your red is your contributions to reserve. Below zero is any revenues that are coming in to offset those system costs. So any transfers from reserve, although we're transferring money to reserve, we're also transferring from a reserve fund to pay for some of the capital. Anywhere that there is significant debt or cap requirements, we've included debt financing in, which is your dark green bars. And any non-rate revenues are also incorporated into that program. And the black line is your smooth, what we call is our net rate funding need. And the net rate funding need represents the amount of money each year that we need to be funding from the water rates. So going forward, you see that the black line is pretty linear, and it kind of takes away the peaks and valleys of a typical capital program as it relates to, you know, funding your operating costs, but also your capital, which is a bit more volatile. So we have to smooth out those programs by doing reserve fund contributions and your debt management strategy. And that helps create that linear line that's in the black, moving from about $2.5 million now to about $3.1 million in 2025 and upwards to just over $4 million by 2030 if we need to fund all the costs that are identified in this capital program and as well as on the operating costs. So just keep that in mind as we're going through the rate analysis. Those total costs represent needs to be funded from the utility rates in our calculation. So if we go to the next slide, it's a very similar story on the wastewater side of things. Operating capital and our contributions to reserve all above zero. And then we have our transfers from reserve as well as any debt financing requirements to be needed to help smooth out the program. Again, more of a linear black line here as well, moving from about $2.7 million in 2020 from a rate perspective to about $3 million in 2025 and upwards of about 3 points by 2030. I guess just the only thing that I like to keep in mind when we do these projections and these studies, really the 3 to 5 year window is what's critical. That gives us probably the best information at this time to make decisions over the short term. Anything on the 5-year planning period, things start to become a little bit more of a forecast, and obviously a lot can change. But when we do set the rates, we really think about kind of that 3 to 5 year window as being where we're basing the information on the best available information at this time. So if we go to the next slide, we can get into some brief observations before we talk about themselves. Generally speaking, your composition of recovery and your of revenues, your fixed charge still represents the lion's share of where your revenues come from. About 63% is coming from the fixed, 40% is from the variable rate. Within the variable rate, your consumption revenue, your non-residential source present a pretty significant share of total consumption revenue, about 40%. So just keeping in mind, obviously your non-residential base here still has a pretty significant impact in terms of how your revenues or how your costs are funded and how your revenues are generated. And then the only thing that we kind of thought about, and we'll keep this as a council information discussion point at the end, the declining block structure that's in place on residential users, it really only applies to very high demand users and very select few customers, 3 or 4. So, it's not, the catchment area is not very big on it. So that's just something to keep in mind from a consideration point if we wanted to maintain that non-residential declining block, or if we wanted to alter it in some respects to give it a bit of a different catchment area. So with that, we'll get into the rates on the next slide. So in order to fund those costs that we've identified, and keeping in consideration the reserve fund management and some of the debt exercise that we'll do, and we'll show you what the reserve fund situation looks like in a couple slides. But the first thing is the rates, again, we did the basis on a 2021 analysis. Your 2021 water rates have been set, and they were just recently passed by council due to the last council session or the one before that. So there's a fixed 1.1% increase in there, and that hasn't changed. What we're coming into is what happened after 2021. So starting in 2022, we've identified at least a need here for about 5.5% increase in the utility rates on the water side per year over the planning period. And that would be on both the fixed charge as well as the variable. So your fixed charge would go up 0.5% each year starting in 2022, as well as your variable rates, both residentially and non-residentially, 5.5% each year. More of the impact here, because of the capital program and the nature of it, the emphasis is placed on the wide. So I know we're seeing 5.5% increase here, but on the next slide, you'll see that there's a bit less of an emphasis or rate requirement on the wastewater side, which is a bit of an offset to both of these categories. So if we move on to the wastewater side of things on the next slide, we're looking at a bit of a different rate increase here. Again, 2021, keeping in consideration that's fixed at about 1.1%. Started in 2022, we're looking at about a 3.5% increase per year from 2022 to 2030. That 3.5% would be applied both on the fixed charge as well as on the variable rate. And when we apply the increase uniformly to both the fixed and the variable, that maintains that 60-40% roughly recovery of your cost that I've identified in the rate structure observation. So we're not really changing the way the revenues are being recovered, certainly just kind of keeping that status quo structure in, but increasing the rates going forward at a uniform rate or uniform percentage point at least each year going ahead. So your next question might be, well, what does this mean to a typical user? So go on the next slide. What does that mean to a typical residential user? So we kind of tried to chart it out, what that means over the next couple of years for a typical household consuming 200 cubic meters a year. So in 2020, recognizing that at 200 cubic meters a year, they pay about $1,294 currently. That 1.1% increase represents about a $14 increase, so that's fixed for 2021. But beyond that, when we take into account the 5.5% rate increase on the water side and 3.5% increase on the wastewater side, at a blended approach, combining both water and wastewater, it represents about 4.5% increase per year for water and wastewater services for a typical user. So your current rate of about $1,300 would move up to about $15,600 per year by 2025, and representing about $50 to $65 each year as that number gets kind of compounded each year. So there is a bit of a sense here that we do need to continue increasing the rates in order to ensure that we have the funds available to fund that capital program. But there is an importance here that when we do try and stick on a rate structure and a category here, and we decide on a rate, we kind of continue to follow through with it, because once we do lose the first couple of years of those rate increases, we lose the compounding in that we built into it. So we continue to fall behind over the long term of what we should be trying to do or we're trying to achieve, and that it will impact our reserve funds and the town's ability to carry out those capital programs and capital projects as identified. So just on the next slide, I did want to provide a bit of a snapshot here on the reserve funds. Recognizing that the program itself and the rates, although they're increasing at just under 5% each year, that doesn't directly translate into the town generating sufficient or significant money that are going into reserve funds. Based on the analysis, you see that our wastewater reserves and as well as the water reserves actually continue to decline over the next kind of 5 to 6 years. They start to pick up again towards the latter end of the period as the rates continue to be enforced and we continue to increase, and partially because towards the end of the period the capital program becomes a little bit more lighter, for lack of a better word, as the projects are a little less known. So there is a bit of that sense in there, but generally speaking, the next 3 to 5 years is really about maintaining what we have. We're not trying to replenish or increase the reserve funds to a substantial degree. They just kind of stay the course and ensure that those monies can be used upon to draw and fund the capital program and the capital requirements as needed. Recognizing that, starting in 2027, you see the water and the wastewater reserves start to increase, but even at that point, by 2030, wastewater is at about $1.8 million, numbers at about $800,000. In contrast to a well over $150 million asset replacement value, it's pretty small in dollar values relative to the total system value. So just to keep some of those figures into context when we're making decisions. So just going on one of the final slides here on the next one, we did want to provide a bit of a comparison of Mounds rates relative to some other communities. And before I get into kind of Smith Falls' position on this graph relative to others, is the system and the delivery of services between each community is unique and very specific to that jurisdiction. Whether they're on a treatment or a well system and they have clean stations, the value of their infrastructure, the cost of delivering the services, their proximity to fresh water, all these types of things have a direct impact on the cost of providing those services and how much money they have in reserves and so on. So the list can go on. So I did want to provide that context. It's not always an apples to apples comparison, but generally speaking, I think it's an important graph for someone to see. For a typical user, what do we pay here in Smith Falls relative to some other communities? And currently, relative to the 2021 calculated or the rates that you currently have in place now, you're kind of right in the middle of the pack relative to this about 12, 15 community comparison here. City of Pembroke and Mississippi Mills certainly on the much higher end of the spectrum, but places like Hawkesbury or Brockville or Clarence Rockland kind of bit of on the lower end of the spectrum relative to these communities. This is both water and wastewater combined, and for someone consuming 200 cubic meters each year. So just I just want to kind of cap off here with a couple of summary slides. So if we go to the next one, I just did want to talk a little bit about that scenario test about adjusting the high volume or high non-residential water user rates. So if we were to make an adjustment to that last tier to eliminate the declining block, what would happen? And effectively, as I mentioned, there's a very limited case in the users that actually that are impacted by that additional rate structure. So we did want to kind of run a test on that. If we were to eliminate the declining block, it would generate about another $50,000 for water and $110,000 for wastewater by 2030. So over the planning period, it's a small amount of money, but it would generate an extra $250,000, $60,000 over the 10-year period. If we were to eliminate that block and charge that last rate or that any consumption over 15,000 cubic meters, the same as what it was if it was under 15,000 cubic meters. And certainly the impact was going to be largely beyond that user 6, which is based on Town Smith Falls user base. They would see the biggest increase in their bill proportionately. And also user 5 would see a nominal increase in their bill. It's really concentrated on those few really large users there. So if we just go to the next slide here, just to kind of talk a little bit about the summary results. Generally speaking, I think there's 5, 6 key takeaways here. The first one, the utility rates that are projected are certainly required to increase in order to fund your operating costs and the capital expenditure renewal requirements here. The analysis does continue to assume that tax-based support continues to support your operations, although the reliance on it does kind of phase out a little bit over the planning period, but still represents a pretty significant share by 2030, but it does kind of come down a little bit. We're continuing to contribute to reserves to ensure that those funds are available to at least stabilize operations and carry out your capital program. Again, as we saw in the reserve fund slide, over the period, the reserves don't grow to a significant amount, but they are there, and the contributions are in order to smooth out the capital. We do recognize that there's a level or inherent risk here, or assumption that you will need some debt financing in order to carry out the capital. And some of that might be offset with kind of capital budget deliberations. Maybe you'll get some grant funding in. There's other ways to mitigate some of those debt financing requirements, but those will all be considered at the time of the capital expenditure. But for the purposes of modeling, we did want to at least assume if we're carrying out this capital, we need this fund, and the principal and the interest payments associated with it are all included in the analysis. It's a true full cost recovery system. Development charges are an important point. You don't have them right now, but you're certainly exploring them. We've incorporated an assumption that there will be some DC funds in order to help offset the system costs. And obviously, if these don't get implemented, then that share of cost that we've identified to be coming from DCs would then be put onto the utility rate base for recovery. So it would just kind of further exacerbate the issue that we're seeing here in terms of recovery of costs. And then the last one is just a consideration for that rate structure change, in terms of the declining block structure for your non-residential users, whether you want to maintain your current structure, kind of eliminate that declining block altogether in 2022, or if there's some other alternative structure that you wanted to put into place, which you could change the threshold from 15,000 cubic meters to some other percentage or threshold from that point. So there's different ways of considering from a modeling perspective, and we have the ability to do that. So that really caps off my presentation. There's a next step slide, but effectively, we're certainly looking here for any feedback on the analysis. We will be looking for coming back to council with a more fulsome report, as well as a financial plan that's going to be put forward that needs to be adopted to go to the ministry for your license renewal application. So that concludes my presentation, and I'll be happy to take any questions. Okay, went a little over my allotted time, so I apologize.
You're okay. You're okay. Thank you very much for that. And there may or may, I'm sure there'll be some questions. So Councillor Dwyer had her hand up.
Sorry, actually, I think Councillor McKenna beat me to it. Peter, you're
Did
okay?
you have your hand up, Peter?
He's good. Okay, thanks, Peter. Okay, thanks. Andrew, I think I've got a pretty good handle on what you've been talking about. Can you help me understand, and perhaps this is a better question for Troy or Janet if she's on the call, but while we're working on our DC study, I'm assuming that at this point, what you're projecting for inclusion in this report is strictly hypotheticals. do we need to have confirmation on what those DC contributions are going to look like before we submit to the ministry, or is the ministry um, willing to accept hypotheticals as part of the equation?
Yeah, so that's a very good question, Councillor, and through the chair. You don't the financial plans that you're going to submit to the ministry are living documents. So you would prepare it based on the best information available at this time, and it doesn't have to exactly coincide with development charge study work or any other municipal initiatives that are ongoing at the same time. At this time, we are preparing it with the assumption of delineating the cost between growth and non-growth, and at this time, that's the best information we have. But you're going to have to at some point make a decision on the development charges, which would then impact your rate study, which, in theory, you would then later down the line update your finance plan to reflect what those decisions might be. But you can still certainly submit the financial plan to the ministry independently of what's happening here.
Okay, thanks. That's good context. And I appreciate that all these documents are kind of in flux, and as they update, one needs another update, and we're back and forth a little bit. I guess my position is that the more we can contribute to these reserves from DCs, the better. And I'm hoping that our DC study is at least getting close to being presented in draft form, so that we may have a pretty good idea of what that looks like before we send you off, Andrew, to finalize this plan for submission. I mean, I am thrilled to see that we're talking about 4.5%, because I think our previous study said 7 and 8. So that's a great position to find ourselves in at this point. And to me, that speaks volumes to how not only Janet has been managing the long-term financial plan on this stuff, but also how Troy and his team in Public Works is finding efficiencies in the system. So kudos to staff all around. Andrew, the only other question I have for you is that when you started to project out kind of what our reserve was going to do over the next 10 years, you showed a reserve balance of about 1.8 million. Is there, for a municipality of our size, working with the type of infrastructure that we have, is there kind of a goal that we should be striving for, wherein, if we can get ourselves to a position where we have 3 million in the bank, then we'll try to achieve, stability there? Or is it too hard with, evolving costs for construction and upgrades for systems like this to actually predict that?
Again, another good question. So there's been more and more questions coming up around what the target reserve fund balance should be and what the limits are. And there is no mandated, provincially prescribed number, but certainly there's some benchmark information that's out there. And a lot of municipalities are starting to look at it in the context of replacement value of their system. And we're seeing a lot of, more and more so now, reserve fund policies that kind of allocate or try and align your replacement value and the reserve. So 2 to 4% is a number that we've been seeing a little bit more commonly. So now you have a replacement value of about 150 million, based on some of the information that we have on the water and the wastewater side. But that number over the next 10 years is going to continue to grow as inflation takes hold. So that 1 million that I talked about, plus the water side, is really, again, a small percentage relative to the total valuation of your assets, likely in 10 years from time. But there also has to be consideration for other things too, like where you're at on your life cycle curve, what the condition of your assets are, and what your asset management plan says. So that's one part of the equation that I told you, but I think there has to be a lot of other competing factors that you have to look at too.
Okay, I think, sorry, Peter, I missed your hand the first time.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And thanks, Andrew, for the report. I had, if I could start at the high level and maybe just one question down into the weeds, if that's okay.
Sure.
It's along the lines of Councillor Dwyer's comments, is that looking at this in isolation, we're also updating our asset management plan and looking at our overall asset management plan, because this is just one aspect of the overall, and knowing what we need to be the impact on the local ratepayers for the greater asset management plan is really important, and taking this out of context, although there's probably nothing more important than the water and wastewater, we have many other assets that we need to protect. So it would be terrific, and the world doesn't line up for me the way I want it to sometimes. So I have to consider this in isolation. And it's difficult. So just about the provincial requirement that we submit a financial plan to obtain and maintain our license. Are there requirements in that financial plan? What are the stipulations? Um, could we just submit a plan and that's all they ask for? Show us your plan? Or are they going to come back and say that's not good enough? Because they can't impose all of this on us and expect the local ratepayers to pay for all of this without some support. So again, in isolation, there are many other assets we need to upgrade, but the costs seem to be borne by the local ratepayers or the local businesses and not by the upper tiers. So is there anything in that requirement for the financial plan that said you must find a balance?
So the only requirement what you have to submit is the council has to pass a resolution indicating that their drinking water system is financially viable, and that's the specific which in there. But it doesn't give you much else other than that, in the sense that you have to, there's very specific accounting reporting documents that we're going to prepare. But it's the rate study is kind of one aspect, and the financial plan is the accounting document that it replicates everything in the rate study. But you just have to identify that it's financially viable, which is up to council's discretion. So it's our job that if we need to put in some language that the municipality is currently undertaking an asset management plan, and the intention of this plan is that it gets revisited once those documents are in place, and that's fine. But that shouldn't be predicated or shouldn't differentiate the rate study, because there's still, there's enough costs here that we've identified from a non-growth perspective, and your operational costs that are real costs and need to be funded, right? And your asset management plan is going to look at your tax supported side of things. So it might look at, holistically, this is how much it's the same person has to pay the water rates, tax rates, but at the end of the day, you still have to fund those system costs from your ratepayers. So although as a group and the way it kind of gets packaged out to the ratepayers is one thing, but it still is a bit of an independent exercise, because these are real costs that need to be done over the next 5 to 10 years.
Thank you. And Mr. Chair, if I could ask my down in the weeds question too. Thank you. The comparable municipalities that you used, that was very helpful. My question is, are any of those municipalities, have they already done, maybe hired you 3 years ago and they've put the plan into place and they're on the track, so their rates are higher for that reason? And are others like Brockville or Prescott or Hawkesbury so far behind that they make it look like they've got this great thing going, but they don't have a plan to actually get there? Because if we implement what you're recommending, the 4.5%, we would be almost in line with Perth. But then is Perth like 3 years ahead of us with their planning? So that it isn't comparing apples to apples, I understand, but
yeah,
where are those municipalities at?
So that's another good question. So some municipalities on there, we've done their studies, and I guess just as an overarching point, you need to do a financial plan in order to get your drinking water license. So everyone on there must have done a plan, but that doesn't necessarily mean each place had done a rate study to underpin financial plan, unlike you guys, which I think is a very good planning perspective to look at your rates too. But the problem is COVID has really kind of thrown the wrench into a lot of places' long-term plans. So places that were potentially on track or going to be increasing their rates did like a lot what you did and kind of hold the line or do a less than type inflation rate increase, right? Which may have kind of tweaked where their projections are going to go. I have to look more into the weeds, as you mentioned, or some are in terms of their rate studies, and maybe if we know when some are coming due. But I would say that everyone was generally within a 3 to 5 year cycle. Some places like Hawkesbury and those ones, I haven't seen them being done in a while. But that could just be the nature of their system. They're smaller systems, and if they're on a mostly fixed charge or however they're charging, they could just be the delivery of services is fundamentally different, right? So their cost recovery is not as much of an issue. And like I said, there's reserve funds, there's capital, there's a lot of different inputs that need to be considered when looking at that table.
Thank you.
Thank you for that. Mayor Panko?
Thank you. Thanks, Andrew. And I guess looking at when we're talking about water and wastewater rate study, there's so many factors that come in here. It seems like it's obviously very fluid, and not knowing where. I guess you've put a lot of assumptions in. I guess even I think of financing the water tower, you had to pick a term, an interest rate, those things that are going to affect obviously what the actual annual payment is. But I guess I got a few specific questions. I guess one, because 63% of our revenue is coming from our fixed rates, and historically we've had a very low level of residential growth until just recently. And I think we would be conservative if we said we expect to see the number of residential rate payers grow by 20% in the next decade. And I assume you're using a rate which would be less than that. So what kind of impact would that potentially have on the rates? And then secondly, we had a report last week which indicated how effective our staff has been in reducing the amount of non-revenue water that we've been losing. And that's come down considerably. We expect that to come down even further. And so obviously if we're not producing as much water, there's less wear and tear on our equipment, our facilities, we're using less chemicals. Does that have an impact on the overall sustainability of the system? And thirdly, the same thing goes for the sewer separation. So the Beckwith Street redevelopment separated sewers, phase 2 will do further. Eventually we do George Street, and we start to see meaningful differences in the amount of wastewater that we're having to treat. And again, the potential savings that would come there as a result of less wastewater flowing through there. So sensitive to the realities that even at $60 a year of an increase on average, it's a fairly significant increase. As Councillor Dwyer said, it's a lot more encouraging than where we were 4 or 5 years ago, but it's still impactful. So I guess overall, I mean, I know if we have reductions in expenses and it may help us build bigger reserves, which we'll need at some point in time. At the same time, trying to be conscious of rates. So how does all that fit together?
No, those are all good questions. And through the chair, so we did make assumptions around growth and assuming that growth is going to pick up over the next 3 to 5 years and over the long term. Maybe not to the extent of 20 or 30% increase on the total base or connection, but certainly a pretty substantial growth increase. When we do financial modeling at the same time, we've got to be somewhat conservative because sometimes the growth building permits come in, but that doesn't translate way immediately into the number of people that are using the system and the number of connections, right? And so there is a bit of a delay and sometimes a lag in that. And that's why we always encourage these rate studies to be done every 3 to 5 years because things like that can change. And when those changes occur, we want to be picking them up regularly through those updated utility rates. On the consumption side, there's also the trend of just declining consumption trend. So even though we are coming up with new users, as I mentioned, so that it's going to come, that the trend is coming down per capita, and part of that is just households are getting smaller, PPUs are declining. The water conservation is such at the forefront of discussion these days. So we expect that to kind of continue to go, and that obviously impacts your revenues as well. Where if there's less people generating water, it's kind of a bit of a double-edged sword. It's great for consumption, but it also impacts your revenues at the end of the year. With your non-revenue water and your water loss, that's a good news story. The implications from a financial perspective would probably be lies over a bit of a longer term. There is going to be some short-term, realizing of cost savings, maybe with chemicals or processing costs and hydro and electricity. But some of the capital requirements and the capital realization of those efficiencies are going to be longer term. In a municipality that was actually purchasing water from an upper tier government, for example, or from another municipality, whose cost efficiencies and realizations of reductions would be more immediate because now you're not going to be paying for all that lost water. here you're the ones producing it, so there's internal efficiency, but it's tough to apply that into the rate modeling at this stage. Because again, some of that might be over the longer term, and I would suspect we would continue to track that and monitor what those changes might be over the next 3 to 5 years. But recognizing that you still have a support from your tax base and your funds aren't extremely high. So any efficiencies that you would see would just help offset or reduce and provide that benefit back to the tax base who's already contributing to fund your operation. So I think there's a bit of an offset and between some of those factors there. So hopefully that kind of helps answer some of those questions. But there is it's based on a series of assumptions. There's no doubt of what can happen and what can transpire. But recognize we're trying to be as somewhat conservative as possible, because I always find sometimes when we look at rate studies, we overestimate the amount of growth that's going to occur and the consumption that's going to happen. And, just given the environment that we've seen subject to this last year, residential consumption has been really coming down. And that does impact the bottom line of what municipalities see from their total revenue projection.
One final question, if I may, Mr.
Yeah.
Chair. I guess we also have the autonomy, I assume, to to change our variable rate, set our fixed rate to try and adapt to the future needs as well.
Correct.
Okay.
Yeah. Like I think your relationship between 60-40 right now is good because you're going into a period where there's going to be some growth and some volatility, and it would be good to see how that translates. So it's good that your revenues are fixed because you do have that deficit coming from the tax base. So any further variances in your revenues, we don't want that tax support to increase over time. I would like to see a decrease. And so by putting more of the revenue recovery on the fixed charges gives you a stability, right? So as that growth comes online over the next 3 to 5 years, we can see how that changes your consumption. And then want to be a little bit more aggressive on the consumption, we can start to see a shift or adjustment down the line. But it'd be good to see how those, what that transpires, especially because a lot of the growth that you're seeing or anticipate to see being high density dwelling unit form, which doesn't always have the consumption pattern of a single family detached unit either. So just keeping some of those things into mind.
Great. Thank you.
Thanks for that. And I believe Councillor Alford had her hand up, but before she speaks, I want to welcome our student councillor, Sarah Lagarde. So welcome, Sarah. And I'm sure you've got lots to say about water rates, but the next presentation may be more of an interest to you. Councillor Alford?
Thanks, Mr. Chair. Just some of my questions have been answered by in questions from my colleagues, but the one that I wanted just a little bit more detail to understand a little bit better, Andrew, is the can you explain in a bit more detail where the block structure, the rate structure would be used? I know you said there weren't many of them, but they could result in a couple $100,000 if we get rid of that structure in the coming years.
Oh, so your current rate structure, you have a declining block in place only for your high volume non-resident users. So if you were to remove the decrease or the discount in volume in consumption over 15,000 cubic meters a year, you would realize some additional revenues because of that. So effectively, anybody who consumes non-residentially over 15,000 cubic meters would then pay the rate that's in place for consumption under 15,000 cubic meters. So they wouldn't get the discount, so you would realize some additional revenues. But I guess part of the point is that it's even over the 10-year period, it's still only $250. So it's not a huge dollar amount. So it's just a matter of if you wanted to continue to maintain that structure or kind of divert from it or make an adjustment to it.
Okay, thanks, Andrew.
Okay, and I think Councillor McGuire is next.
Mr. Chair, thanks for your report, Andrew. I really appreciated the benchmark of town rate slide because it's super useful to communicate with constituents and really visualize where we're at. I'm wondering if if you've got data on production delivery costs, commercial revenues, tax subsidies, and development charges and how they play a role in that. And if we could aggregate that into one visualization to really paint the whole picture. Is that something that's been done before?
It's tough to through the chair to kind of mesh all those different ones together. Certainly development charges we do, and we always find it difficult with tax rates and other incentive programs because you are right. Like, this is telling one side of the story, but we may be middle of the pack on water rates, but by far the lowest on tax rates or whatnot, right? So there's different ways of looking at it. It's to package that together and really try and tell the message. I'm trying to focus solely on and kind of hone in on the water rate systems and the wastewater rate systems, because that's obviously the purpose of the study, but also the costs associated within the revenue recoveries and looking at how we're going to generate sufficient for that. But I can certainly do some other information and benchmarking for you, trying to see how it all, like I said, telling the story, how it meshes together. Sometimes it gets a little mucky just because, there's a lot of other things, reserve funds and, the cost of doing business in each of the municipalities. So I'd be hesitant to put that out there in a public forum unless it got really vetted and reviewed. And, there was a lot of thought put into how the messaging is, but it's something internally that I can share with staff. I can help out with a little bit with that. And you'll be seeing the development charge comparisons come through when we come forward for the DC study.
Great. And then, so the last report said we had to do 7 and 8% increases. This report's saying 3.5 and 5.5. Is there any reasons other than growth to attribute for the decrease in increase?
Part of it is just related to kind of where we're at. Growth is taking form, but it's also how quickly and how we want to manage the tax supported funding share too. Like, there's different assumptions around that and how much we want to use debt. So, we could, certainly we have the justification to increase the rates at a further than what we've shown at 5.5% and 3%. But at the same time, from a council perspective, what's palatable and what's the best way to go about this from your residents and your businesses, right? So we did try and put another layer of review in there to see, what we can actually implement and how we can use debt and some of the measures that we currently have to help fund the system over the long term. And rather than front-ending the rates, we've kind of spread them out over a bit of a longer period too. So just keeping that in mind too, right?
Thanks, Andrew. And last questions for council. Is there a consensus to talk about the block rates at a future committee as a whole, or is that something that's been settled?
Put that out there. We'll table that just for a sec, Councilor McGuire. I just had a couple, maybe this will clarify it, but really this exercise is something that we need to do. And Andrew, you can correct me if I'm wrong, but we need to demonstrate that our water system is financially viable, which it has been and it will continue to be. We provide safe drinking water for our residents, as we heard last week, and so I know that there's a mandate from the province to make your water system financial sustainable through your rates, but there's no regulation to mandate that at this point. And so we've always been cognizant of what the ratepayer can absorb, although it comes out of their taxes as well. But when we're talking about from 2020 to 2025, you're going to pay $266 more a year than you were paying in 5 years from now. You're going to pay $6. So we have to balance that with what we're charging for our mill rate. So I think a couple of points of the presentation. One is the consumption, and it was flatlined and actually going lower. And we have a major industrial user right now, and I don't know if that was part of that equation. So, and the other part was the water tower. It was a flat capital expense of I can't remember, $15 million or something. So obviously we're going to need Upper Teal help for that. So would that be part of a revised plan?
So I guess from starting with the second question on the capital, So we have both we have the cost in there for the tower and the standpipe, but we also assuming there's a DC component which isn't shown there. That's just a non-growth related share, but it is spread out. But we haven't assumed upper tier funding for it. So if you did get provincial funding to help offset the program or federal funding, that would obviously help reduce that capital, but it also might help just reduce the debt financing that we've assumed in order to carry out that project. So we did assume that there's interest costs associated with carrying that out. And obviously, if you get some upper tier funding, then that would just offset that or burden. But it doesn't mitigate the need for the rate increases that we're showing, because that would still be needed. On the consumption side, non-residential consumption sometimes is difficult to predict. We did make assumptions that there's going to be growth in it, but a stabilization. But as you see from the previous ones, even with some new businesses starting up, there's also ones that become more efficient and streamline operation. So any additional consumption that is included outside of what we're showing would then just provide further revenues for the town, which would help offset some of the shortfalls that we're seeing there from a tax supported base.
Okay, thanks. And finally, I mean, I think what you've presented us is very, very comprehensive. Is good. My final question would be, with revisions, when we submit this to the ministry, is council tied into it? I.e., does that mean that we have to follow through, or do we have discretion year to year?
Each rates would be set through the capital budget each year or through your council, your budgeting process. So you have the discretion to adjust it. If you're making changes to the long-term plan, obviously we encourage the financial plans to be updated and reflected accordingly. My only caution, and I discussed this with lengths with staff, is that when we make in-year reductions to the rates, it just puts us further back down the line, because 5.5%, if we do 0% in 2022, then we're behind the 5.5%, but also the compounding that would have existed on the higher rate too. So there is it's kind of a bit of a double-edged problem, right? So just keep that in mind if we're making in-year adjustments, we kind of fell behind the 8 ball if we don't make that adjustment back in 2023 or onwards. And apologize for my screaming kid in the background, but
No problem.
Yeah.
We're all
mean
kind
that,
of enjoying it, Andrew.
yeah,
That's right. Yeah.
Watching you
It's
be
not
tortured.
no.
That's right. It's not as enjoyable when you're on
Luckily-
every meeting and he's crying. Yeah.
Luckily, the dog is not having a drink of water right now, so that's okay.
That's right.
But I guess my point was going to be that we're obviously going to supply clean drinking water up to, I don't know, what were we, 97% compliant, as we heard last week, and we're going to pay for it. It's just how we're going to pay for it. There's only one taxpayer, right? So if we need to go on the tax side, we're going to do that. But I haven't heard from the province that oh yes, you're going to be self-sustaining within 10 years. I haven't heard that yet. There's no reg for that, is there?
I haven't heard that either. No. They talk about a full cost recovery system, and they should be self-sustaining, and we support that notion. But you're making an effort to dwindle it down, but they have a date that you have to be mandated to remove the tax support funding share.
Yeah, and the water rates go up here every year. So anyway, thanks for the presentation. Any more questions from my colleagues? I think Councillor Albert was first. Go ahead.
Well, just you had tabled Councillor McGuire's question as to whether.
Oh yes, you're right.
Sorry.
Sorry, what was that?
Mr. Chair, if I can jump in here.
Yeah, would you?
So yeah, the declining block rate had its genesis in a strategy that was developed, an economic development strategy actually, to attract food processing and beverage and food processing industries. And since then, we have attracted a bottling facility. So, but it may be time to relook at the thresholds associated with the block rate. So my response to Councillor McGuire would be that is something staff can bring forward separately. I don't think the rate study necessarily requires you to make that decision right now, but I would suggest we do bring it forward because it is an important policy discussion.
Okay. Thank you for that. Councillor Alfred?
No, that answers, Malcolm's answered both my, Councillor McGuire's and my question. Other than one comment in that we've known the importance of DCs, and this only further magnifies why that work needs to be done as soon as possible. And I only wish we'd started it 2 years ago, well, maybe 4 years ago.
As a person doing your DC study, there will be results soon. So
well, we look forward to that. Any other questions? So I want to thank Andrew for that presentation, and we'll look forward to going further with this and complying with the ministry's requirement for us to display or demonstrate we are a financially viable water system.
Great. All right. Thanks, everyone. Appreciate you having me.
Councillor Alfred has the last word.
No, just to say, I noticed the baby's gone quiet now. So now that you're finished.
That's right. Yeah, he's eating now.
Okay. Thank you, Andrew. Thank you for being here.
Great. Thanks, everyone. Bye for now.
Okay. Now we have another presentation this evening. It's Stephen Slaluta, Senior Project Consultant from RC Strategies, and it's our Parks and Recreation Master Plan. And sorry for butchering your name, which I should have not done.
No problem at all. And Ashley, I'm joined here by my colleague Michael Cleland. He's going to start, and then I'll interject a little bit later on. So over to you, Michael.
Thank you, Steve. And good evening, Mr. Chair and members of council. Thanks for welcoming Steve and I to your meeting tonight to talk about the Recreation and Parks Master Plan. You know, as planners with a real passion for community and getting involved with community to create master plans, we're thrilled to be working with you and really have enjoyed the onboarding process with Art and Tana and the team. Really professional group you have working with you. So we're early in the process, as you may know and will know. So this presentation is intended to offer really an overview of what's involved in key stages of work, beginning with what to expect overall. So next slide, please. The whole master plan endeavor is really a 10-year look to guide planning and investment for your decision making related to parks and recreation, and that's in alignment with your strategic plan. It's really looking to balance some aspiration that you have, the community has for parks and recreation, and the investment in it with a pragmatism that exists with just leveraging and optimizing the existing strengths that the town is starting the planning process with. And indeed, there are many to be proud of. The plan will be very responsive to growth-related demand, and it will provide, be based on guidance that provides best approaches to providing service. Next slide, please. So the inputs that we have already started working on a number of these, but we'll certainly be, working. I've already had these conversations with Andrew and his team at Hempson, along with town staff on future projections and changing demographics related to growth and shifts in the population as a result of normal population aging. We'll be looking at provincial and national trends related to parks and recreation and leading practices that we see in Eastern Ontario municipalities, but as our firm practices broadly across the country, practices that we see as leading in other jurisdictions in Western Canada and Central Canada. And really taking guidance from seminal work that the industry and the sector have undertaken in the recent term, particularly with the Framework for Recreation in Canada, a piece of work that I personally have been involved with, and our firm has leveraged in a lot of our planning work with the community across the country. Similar to the water and wastewater presentation, a benchmarking exercise across different core service areas with comparable municipalities. Looking at your inventory and relating that to your asset management plans, as well as growth projections, and really understanding from a spatial point of view how the distribution of assets is working for the community, and based on community change that's projected, where there may be need for investment in new assets or refurbished assets over time. We're certainly looking at planning policies and current practices, particularly changes related to the Planning Act and parkland acquisition, development charges. All of these policy areas become relevant to putting a master plan for Parks and Recreation together. And really, truly as a planner, and most importantly as well, the resident and stakeholder engagement is really core to the process. And Steve is going to take you through an explanation of the activities that we have planned for that, which will be starting shortly. Next slide, please. As part of the master plan development process, we'll be looking at identifying key community issues through conversation with community, with stakeholders, with users of your facilities and parks, with staff as well. And really taking all of that input to frame strategic possibilities and directions for the basis of the master plan, the framework for the master plan. From there, we establish goals and actions that provide pathways for suggesting priorities for implementing the plan over time. And what you should expect, obviously, is a plan that really establishes the priorities using a structured, transparent, and rationale-based approach, right? You should be expecting a good business case for at least the near-term priorities and the most important long-term priorities as an output of this plan. Next slide, please. So as I said, we're at the beginning of the process. We just onboarded in mid-January, and we're in the process of some significant data collection, information collection, both from staff as well as from the community. And that will run until around the end of March, early April. And we hope to come back, we will come back to council with an update on what we've heard and learned through that process, really to frame out key issues and themes. Leading us into phase 2, which is really the master plan development piece, which will occur in early spring. And we will come back to council with a draft plan for you to provide input and guidance on. We're targeting around May right now. And then phase 3, which is really the finalizing piece and seeking public and stakeholder feedback on the plan in June and July before it's brought back to council for final approval. Next slide, please. So I'll pass it over to Steve, and he's going to provide a deeper dive into the engagement activities that we've developed as part of this process. Steve?
Thanks, Mike. So we just want to give everybody a flavor for really what we're looking to accomplish here with the engagement, and then how we're going to be actually executing upon the engagement. So on the right-hand side of the slide there, we've outlined some very high-level engagement goals, and really, in a nutshell, what we like to do with these processes is just make sure we touch as many corners of the community as we can to make sure that the master plan's not influenced by just a few points of view, but really a broad-based understanding of recreation and parks needs and wants and perspectives in the community. So for that reason, we use a number of different engagement tactics to touch everyone or as many people in the community as we can, and then generate the data that we need to be able to get an understanding of the current state and what some of the priorities ought to be moving forward. So one of the immediate tactics we're going to be undertaking here in the next few weeks is a number of stakeholder and user group interviews. So we'll be doing those via Zoom with a whole host of different interests in the community. And that's just really a chance for us to get a lay of the land and understand, what's good with those groups, what's maybe challenging those groups, what they think should be priorities moving forward, and so forth. We're also going to be sending out a user group questionnaire to those groups and a whole bunch of others. Just another way for us to, again, understand where those groups are going, what their participation numbers are, what they see as priorities moving forward, that sort of thing. And then the last tactic there, which is very significant to our work, is a resident survey, and I'll just provide an overview of that on the subsequent slide. So next slide, please. So the resident survey. So we're going to be fielding the resident survey here through the month of March, and we're still working on organizing the logistics and the specific timing. So on the right-hand side of the slide there is a postcard that we'll be mailing out to households in the community. So it's a coded postcard. So on one side, the color side, is some information on the project. On the black and white side, there's going to be a unique access code. So every resident that gets the postcard will get a different code. There's information on where to go to complete that survey website through the town's website. Project page rather. And then we're also going to have a paper copy pickup option available as well. So there'll be a number there where someone can call to request a paper copy of the survey. And we'll also have a non-coded option available of the survey as well that we'll stagger and make available through that same project page a week or two later. And then really, I guess a little bit of our request for help here from you is once that survey the postcard has been mailed out for the survey, we just ask you to remind your friends and neighbors and others to fill out that survey and be a little bit of our free publicity, if you wouldn't mind. Next slide, please. So the question always comes up. So, hey, why are you guys doing this coded postcard survey methodology here? Well, there's a couple reasons that we want to go about doing that. Number one, it's a form of providing a statistically representative survey. So we can say that the survey results will be reliable within plus or minus X percent. It's usually 5 or 6% if we get a pretty average response rate. That also mitigates any special interest group potentially jeopardizing the survey. So believe it or not, sometimes in communities you get a certain user group or an interest group that decides they want to rally around a survey and push forth a certain perspective. This methodology, because you can only fill out the survey once, you can only use your code once, that to a large degree will take away any risk of that occurring. The postcard is just frankly a good promotional piece, both for the survey and for the project. So everybody will get a piece of information that'll tell them a little bit about the project and encourage participation in the survey. So number of benefits to using the coded postcard method. We've used it quite successfully across dozens and dozens of other projects and expect that it'll work well with this one as well. And I think from there, we'll turn it back over to Mike, and I think any questions is the next slide here.
That's right. Yep, next slide. That's the end of the presentation. So happy to take any questions. Over to you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Michael and Steve. And I'm sure we're going to have some questions. Councillor Allen has her hand up first.
Yes, thank you, Stephen and Michael. I read this over with great interest. It's something that I care a great deal about, and I'm sure many Smiths Falls citizens feel the same way. We have our beautiful river running through our town, and we have so much green space. And a lot of it has been, it's just been empty, or it hasn't been animated in any way. But it's important because we all know that children should grow up outdoors. The more time they spend outdoors, the better they're going to be, and the happier we're all going to be. So I like this plan. I love the fact that you're doing a survey that's identifying people just having one feedback note to you. I think it will give us a lot of understanding of what our citizens are hoping to have. And I know just looking at some of our new subdivisions and walking around our town, there are so many of our old parks that could use some new animation and some excitement put back into them. So I hope we look at all of that in this plan, and I'm excited about this. I'm just thankful that you came tonight and shared it, and look forward to working with you as this moves forward. Thanks.
Thank you.
Thanks for that. Councillor Alfred?
Thanks, Mr. Chair. Yes, this is rather exciting. It is something that we identified originally in our strategic plan, when one of our very first meetings. Just a couple of notes. I'm glad to see that you're doing the survey, but I also know that when we talk about recreation, the definition of recreation now is much different than it used to be. And recreation, as we've seen during COVID, can be a solitary pursuit, not any organized sports or events or activities. So I'm hoping that those kind of ideas will be front and center in this as well. I'm a proponent, like Councillor Dwyer and Councillor Allen are, of the wild play or unstructured play. I had more fun playing across the road in the bush from my grandparents' place than any playground I have ever visited. So I'm hoping that will be part of this plan as well. I'm sure it will be. I don't really have any other comments to make, other than I'm looking forward to this, and that some of our parks, and I don't know how you go about this, but in some of our parks, are they any longer needed or wanted in the places where they are, and maybe resources could be diverted? I'm sure that will be part of the discussions you fellows have as well. So thanks very much. I look forward to seeing what the results of the survey are when in May, I guess we'll see those.
Thanks. If Mr. Chair, if I could just quickly touch on one
Yes.
of the comments there that Councillor Alford provided. So Michael referenced the National Recreation Framework, and that includes an extremely holistic definition of what recreation is. So thanks for bringing that up. It's a great point, and something that we're training ourselves to think about as broadly as we can about recreation. And I mean, what I always say to people when we do engagement is that if you think it's recreation, we're going to think it's recreation too. So we'll be sure to have that influence our conversation with stakeholders.
Perfect. Thank you.
Councillor McKenna, and then Councillor Dwyer.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thanks for the presentation, gentlemen. Just what are the assumptions? Because council hasn't talked about it. We've just said we want to do a Parks and Recreation Master Plan. I didn't see any assumptions at the beginning of this. For example, will the town continue to operate? We may continue to own some of these assets, but will we? What are the assumptions we're starting with? And has there been a conversation, perhaps among staff, or where are we starting with that? Is it something that we haven't put a value on it, other than say we want to do it? Is it the most important thing that this council feels like? So what assumptions are you making as we go into this? What's on the table, and is there anything off the table?
Yeah, Mr. Chair, great question. And what we're looking at is recreation as an experience for residents and visitors to the community. So what we try to do is a very high level kind of match the expectations and the experience that people are looking for with the assets that we have available to us. Try to look at a longer term vision of what that might look like. So where Michael was talking about growth potential and projecting out our population numbers over the next little while. We've been working closely with the DC group, as well as with our other groups, just to try to give some context to that. So what we're hoping for is a discussion around what is the best use of the lands that are available to provide the best experiences for people in the community. And we're not getting down necessarily to the level of saying, are we the best operator for this? We do that, and we do that on a fairly regular basis, where we have other people providing services. And a great example of that is our relationship with the Big Brothers Big Sisters group, operating program out of here that was something that we started in partnership and developed in partnership. So we're certainly looking at all of those things, but in the longer term, it's to give us guidance on the decision making that goes into meeting that growth demand.
If I may, Mr. Chair?
Yes.
Just one more. So would another assumption be is that as Councillor Alford has alluded to, my perception of Parks and Rec is antiquated. And when I read some of the frameworks, is part of it that we want to take our community, because if you're going to do a survey and ask them, what do you think is really valuable to Parks and Rec? They're going to talk about arenas and curling and some of the traditional, where we may want to go. So is the assumption is that we do want to modernize or bring our park and give it a vision for the future and bring our community along with us?
Michael had your hand up there. I saw it.
Yeah. Through you, Mr. Chair. I mean, I think the approach we take with these studies in general is that we don't come in with too many assumptions. We assume a planning process will help uncover good principles that are informed by community input through that process. And the plan becomes then an aspiration of the community as it's completed. And different parts of the community, including council, will have input and influence over that as we move through it. So that in general is just our starting point. It isn't a cookie cutter exercise, and it certainly isn't an exercise that assumes we understand how leisure is provided or what residents in any particular community do for leisure and recreation and parks and recreation. We want to learn, and we've crafted instruments and techniques to help us learn through the process. And I'd also say that, having driven through Smith Falls last week myself, I mean, it's a community that brings tremendous assets and strengths. And so the process makes a very significant assumption that we're going to build from those strengths and those assets, not necessarily recreate them and go in very different directions. These are very important parts of community, the fabric of community. And so the process really takes that into perspective. As much as it will provide an aspirational vision and goal to move forward with, it really is leveraging, to begin with, the strengths and assets that the community already has.
That's helpful. Thank you.
Mr. Chair, if I could just quickly add to what Michael said there as well.
Absolutely.
So I think another often finding of the engagement we do is just the level of diversity that exists in terms of people's recreation pursuits and the activities that they like to do. Often I think sometimes we hear from the squeaky wheels of the very organized group, and we don't necessarily always understand the level to which things like parks and trails and those more spontaneous recreation pursuits are, or how important they are. And our engagement process, I think, will provide some really valuable insight into those things as well, and maybe might make us think a little bit differently.
Great, thanks for that. Councillor Dwyer?
Thanks. Thanks, gentlemen. I've thought a lot about what I want this plan to be, and I think the thing that I keep coming back to the most is the fact that I don't want this plan to just be a plan, right? I want it to be an actionable series of objectives that we're going to start to actually hold ourselves accountable to. I think for too long, this town's been a bread and butter hockey town, and not to say that there's anything wrong with being a hockey town, but I think that that's really kind of the primary driver behind rec and culture in the area. And having worked for the town and now working in other towns, I realize that there's fantastic opportunities for other sorts of leisure activities. And I love that word, Michael, leisure. We're not creating a recreation master plan. We're looking at a leisure plan. You know, what do people enjoy doing with their free time? But I want to be conscientious about the fact that, you know, one person's pursuits and leisure may not be a good business case for the municipality to take on, you know, and I know that we always have some little grassroots initiatives that really want to champion a specific interest, but unless there's meaningful buy-in from the community, it's sometimes not a good use of our resources. You know, personally, I would like to see us making better use of the facilities that we do have, and perhaps, you know, one of the deliverables that comes out of this is a meaningful scheduling plan to work with our community stakeholders so that we don't have these assets that are sitting there underutilized. We have so many of them. And I'll be honest, I mean, I think I can think of a handful of groups that organize themselves in the upper hall of the arena, or the Kinsman Pavilion, or the Senior Center, which is used exclusively by seniors, but often sits vacant and unused for majorities of the week, you know? So I think if anything, my hope is that this plan can start to pull together those community players so that we have a better idea of what their operating needs are, so that we can look to optimize efficiencies within our own development. Councillor Alford made an interesting point about, you know, maybe it's time to broach the subject of, do we really need a park over here that perhaps we haven't been using for X number of years? Personally, I've been in a municipality that has tried to sell parkland. Don't do it. It's a mistake. It's a big mistake. But that said, I mean, maybe it doesn't have to look the way it does right now, right? Maybe the ball diamond that has been underutilized there and is just, you know, looking in a decrepit state doesn't need to be there. Maybe it needs to be a play structure. But I will say, and my comments in the survey are definitely going to reiterate this, oh my God, we need a new play structure in town. Okay. There's like fundamental, it needs to happen. And if it is not one of the recommendations coming out of this master plan, I think there's something seriously wrong, because I mean, I know I'm not alone in driving my children out of town to find a half decent playground. Because when I get to those playgrounds, it's usually full of parents from Smiths Falls. So, I mean, my hope is that this is going to really kind of draw attention to the priorities for the municipality, and not just what the seven of us feel, or in particular staff feel, but really what's going to be a meaningful impact to the community.
Okay, thank you for that. Councilor McGuire.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you, Steve and Michael. This is really exciting. We've been talking about it for a while, so to get some slides together and look at them is really great. I'm wondering, I really like the postcard idea. I think, you know, we've tried consultation for all kinds of things before, and it's really hard to get that meaningful turnout. So really happy to see something innovative there. I'm wondering, how do we go after our young people? Will there be any consultation directly with the schools to get students' opinion heard?
Maybe I'll start, Michael, and then you can jump in if I miss something here. Yeah, so great question. And, you know, I think our approach to engagement here is going to be pretty flexible. So certainly if there's opportunities for us to engage with youth in the community, whether, you know, it's directly through the school or otherwise, we would certainly like to do that. And we'll just have to work with Art and his team there to figure out the best way to do that, or the most appropriate way to do that, especially given some of the you know, the challenges or concerns with COVID right now. But certainly we'd love to get the youth perspective, because obviously you know, it's a very important cohort, and really encouraged that you have a youth member on your council there as well. So maybe Sarah, you might have some ideas for us around that as well.
Great. And it's for
That was my next question. Sarah, go ahead, Chris.
If we see through the postcard system that there's like a certain neighborhood's underrepresented, do you have any tools to kind of nudge more responses, or how does that work?
Through the chair, yeah, good question. Typically, that isn't an issue. I mean, like I said, we've done this in a whole bunch of places, and usually, you know, I guess it speaks to the strength of the methodology. Usually, there's a very consistent response, or the response aligns well with census data in terms of where people live. So we do some of those checks on our end just to make sure that we're all good on that front. But we can track the responses in real time. So we're going to ask people where they live on the on the survey, and if we see that we're under or overrepresented in a certain part of town, then we can work with communications to figure out how to maybe target some of those residents.
Great. And last question is, I love all this conversation about leisure. Will the plan look at how we can incorporate arts, culture, and Indigenous placemaking into our public spaces?
I was just wondering if you're. So I'll go. Sorry, through you, Mr. Chair. We have a series of meetings scheduled with different organizations that provide services or programming to the community. It would be, traditionally considered cultural services. And we've worked with staff to identify outreach to Indigenous community as well as part of this planning process. So we've yet to have those conversations, but I think we've made efforts through the consultation planning that we're doing right now to hear from those organizations and those communities, and to respect and reflect the input they provide us into the planning process.
Just a quick add on to that too, not so much related to engagement with those groups, but something we're doing more through other plans, we have done more through other plans, is try to find ways to integrate truth and reconciliation and the calls to action, or demonstrate some alignment between priorities, or maybe how municipalities can align with some of those calls to action that are pertinent to sport, recreation, leisure, arts, and culture. So that's something that we'll be looking to, of course, do with this plan as well, recognizing how important that is, and the benefits of doing that.
Okay, thank you for that. I know, Councillor Alford, you had your hand up, but I'm going to ask Student Councillor Lagarde, do you have any comments from a youth perspective?
Well, thank you. I was going to ask one of those questions. I had actually written it down, and was looking at the statistics for our age, like the age populations in Smiths Falls, and I was actually surprised by the amount of youth that there is. I think that the PowerPoint is very well organized, so I don't have any questions or inquiries. But regarding the user group questionnaire for targeting youth groups, more specifically through schools, I don't have any current suggestions, but I do have one small request. Some surveys are very well written, while others I find can be harder to understand, as the questions can be quite detailed. So if in this questionnaire, I don't know if you've written it yet or not, that it'd be very understandable and easy to comprehend for everyone. That is it. Thank you.
Thank you. Steve?
Yeah, through the chair. Yeah, great comments, Sarah. And I mean, I don't profess to be a plain language expert. There are actually, believe it or not, people that make a living on making the language in surveys more understandable. But we do try as best we can to make sure that we're not defaulting to words that are maybe too complex or that are too nebulous. So yeah, appreciate the comment, a great comment, and it is something we have thought about in our narration of the survey.
Great. And Sarah, you'll notice that in the presentation, part of our responsibility as counselors and you as a student counselor is to get the word out and to make sure we get as many inputs as we can get. So we're counting on you. Councillor Alford.
Just one with regard to messaging that Councillor Dwyer touched on, and Councillor McKenna talked about before. In order to overcome some of the paradigms as to what recreation is supposed to be, I think if we could, in our messaging, talk equally or mention equally as many times leisure as we do recreation, that may help solicit more ideas from more people. Because as I said, during COVID, much of the recreation around here has been solitary, and trails, paths, things like that have become ever more important. And some of this stuff, some of this behavior, when COVID is over and we return to some level of normalcy, is going to continue. We will see this well into our future. So if we could talk about leisure and recreation in our messaging, I think that might be helpful.
Okay, thank you for that. Any other comments, questions? I'll just say that I want to thank you for that presentation. I really look forward to moving forward on this plan. And one of the best parts of it is your plan for community engagement, because it's incumbent on us to find out what our citizens really want. And I think we have an open book here, and it's limitless. And so thank you for that. And we look forward to talking to you guys in the near future. So thanks so much for coming. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thanks for having us.
Okay. Anytime. So we'll move along. We have no adoption of minutes. We do have several directors' reports. I'll start off with Director of Corporate Services, Carrie Costello, with the report I understand you have.
Thank you. I've got three updates this evening for all of you. The first is a vacancy on our library board. So if there's anybody interested in filling that vacancy, they can submit an application to the clerk's office. They can either call, email, or check online for the application form. They can contact Deputy Clerk Bennett at 283-4124, extension 1102. Second announcement I have this evening is regarding Heritage Week, which was last week. The MHC typically hosts some sort of event. This year, the Heritage Hunt was placed on hold due to the stay-at-home order. Since we've moved to the green zone, the event is back on track, and they're proposing to have a scavenger hunt for the month of March for residents to explore Smiths Falls heritage and its designated heritage buildings. Photos and clues will be used to get participants to the applicable buildings. This will be a COVID compliant event. They'll be on the outside of the buildings only. Participants will be encouraged to stay within their households. Face masks and social distancing will be practiced, and any participants who feel unwell will be encouraged to stay at home. All of this has been vetted through the health unit, the Smiths Falls Police Department and Fire Department, and anybody who has interest or would like further information is encouraged to contact Mary Remick in the town's planning office. And the third and final update I have is regarding the CIP COVID-related applications. Just an update for council that there is still nothing to report, that the planning department has received no applications for additional funding due to COVID. And that was a council direction, I think about a year ago. So that's all of my updates.
Thank you. Any questions for Director Costello? Seeing none, we'll move along. Deputy Clerk Nadine Bennett is with us for a report.
Good evening. I'm here on behalf of Fire Chief Rick Cheeseborough, and I'm going to give an update about the Emergency Control Group. The Emergency Control Group met for their 50th time last week. It was our 50th meeting. Hard to believe that we've already had 50 meetings since the beginning of this. Chief Cheeseborough, he provided different statistics with respect to Ontario, Canada, and our local health unit. At the time of the meeting, the caseload was 11 active cases in our local health unit, but I did check the website just previous before our meeting, and that has decreased to 10. So the health unit website is showing 10 active cases, 2 active in hospital, 1 active in ICU, 1 active ventilated, for a total of 854 cases. Total resolved is 790. The total deaths is 54. And that's the statistics as of just before our meeting tonight. At the meeting, they discussed personal protective equipment, and our supplies are stable here in the municipality. There are concerns about the variant and the fear of more lockdowns. The state of emergency is maintained at this time, and it will be reviewed again at our next emergency control group meeting. Vaccination centers will be opening. They are in progress of doing that. To date, the health unit provided last week, and I don't know if the number has increased since last Thursday, but as of Thursday, it was 2,579 people in our region that had been vaccinated. And they've received their first vaccine and they're waiting on the second one. Following that, Chief Cheeseborough did discuss with the group just outside of the pandemic. The control group has to maintain compliance for 2021. So they discussed the compliance measures for 2021, which will include an exercise and review of our plan again. And there is training that will be required. So even though we are in a pandemic, we will proceed with those compliance measures for Emergency Management Ontario. And so our plan will be reviewed and updated on the website, and that will be coming forward later this year to council. So that's everything.
Okay, thank you for that. Questions, comments? Okay, seeing that, thank you so much, Nadine. Thank you. Next, we have Director of Community Services, Art Manhire, with a couple of reports. Thank you, Art.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Just a couple of quick updates. The Senior Center is going to be opening starting tomorrow. They have a couple of activities. They're going to be doing the shuffleboard as well as exercise classes. Anybody interested in services should contact the Senior Center. They will be following protocols that were established before the lockdown, so in the fall, that have been vetted by public health. So numbers reduced and some of the access reduced. But either way, there is a service available there for them. The outdoor rink is kind of getting the brunt of our warmer weather at this point. We still have part of it open. We'll try to keep as much of it open as we can this week, but we are looking at forecasts of 5 degrees by Thursday. And what's happening is the ground is actually absorbing heat, and the ice is chipping off from the concrete. So we have staff out there flooding as we can when the weather gets colder, but we anticipate that sometime this week we may have to shut that down as the ice comes out of there. Indoor spaces are still being confirmed this week. If user groups are looking for space, it is filling up very, very quickly, which is a nice thing to see. But they should be in touch with our offices this week, as we are getting confirmation from all of our users by the end of this week. And then, as Council heard earlier, the Parks and Rec Master Plan, we've developed kind of a communication strategy there. So I would encourage the public to look for opportunities to give feedback. Anybody who is in user groups will be invited to interviews, but there will also be mail outs as well as some opportunity to use other mediums to collect messaging around what the public's looking for in terms of leisure and recreational activity.
Okay, thank you for that. Any questions, comments? Thanks, Art, and especially on the Senior Center. It's good to get that clarified, so I appreciate your work on that. Thank you. Next, we have our Director of Economic Development, Jennifer Miller, the award winner.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So on Thursday evening, Mr. Bruce Linton was awarded the Lieutenant Governor's Ontario Heritage Award for Excellence in Conservation for his restoration of the Fuller Post Office here in Smiths Falls. So just a few thanks this evening to those who wrote letters of support for the nomination, including Mayor Pankow, Chris Samir on behalf of the Chamber of Commerce, Dorothy Hudson on behalf of the Municipal Heritage Committee, Lisa Purden-Bell on behalf of Heritage House, and Bill Dobson on behalf of the Historical Society. And I know we all share in the pride of this restoration, and we're deeply grateful for everything that Bruce and his team have invested in this important property in Smiths Falls. So as the chair has insinuated, it's been a good month of recognition for Smiths Falls. So I'm also happy to announce that our Town of Smiths Falls picnic program has now been shortlisted for the Lieutenant Governor's Award for Marketing Excellence in Ontario. As you will recall, Smiths Falls recently won an award for this program through the Economic Developers Council of Ontario. And winners of those awards are reviewed and some are put forward for this honor. And so we've been shortlisted with one other community, and the winner will be announced this Wednesday on the final day of the EDCO conference. And finally, I'm pleased to announce that St. Lawrence College has launched their one-week Tourism and Hospitality Fundamentals program to both current employees in Smiths Falls and job seekers, both in Smiths Falls and in Kingston. So we were happy to be chosen as one of those communities. This web-based program is free to the participants. And on top of getting a micro credential in tourism and hospitality fundamentals from the college, participants will earn their SmartServe and Safe Food Handler certification. And they can also get a certification in soft skills solutions. So this is just another way we can support our small businesses during this pandemic. Thank you.
Awesome. Comments, Councillor McKenna? Questions?
Thank you, Jennifer. I really liked the press release that went out regarding the Mr. Linton's award. I especially appreciated the initial photo of the construction. I was a little confused about the photo that went along with that and wondered, is there some way that we couldn't add what the building actually looks like today? It looked like it was the photo from when it was deteriorated. And I wondered if we could replace that, because not only for those folks who can't drive by it, they don't get to see it in its glory right now. And there'll be people across the country interested in seeing that photo, even if you left that rough one up and just showed somehow what they've done with the building. It was just, it was an odd picture to put in there. It's not the one of the finished product now. So it just, could we add one to it and resend it or something?
Thank you. We'll take a look at that. Thank you, Councillor.
Okay, I think someone else had their hand up, but I missed it. Councillor Allen.
I just wanted to thank you, Jennifer, and all of your staff and the people working with you. The programs that you've been doing in our town to support our businesses and to promote downtown, I know my family have been using them and enjoying them very much. And now to be given an award for them, for their creativity, just well done. Thank you so much for all the effort.
Thank you.
Awesome. Applause. Thank you. Okay, we have one final report from CO Morris, I believe.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chair. Jennifer's a tough act to follow. I don't have any awards to announce, but I'm hoping we will be rewarded with what I'm going to talk about. Staff are actively working on a couple of funding applications that are very timely. One is the Canada Healthy Community Initiative. It's looking for projects between $5,000 and $250,000 in value. And so they're looking, they've developed 3 themes. One is safe and vibrant public spaces. The other is improved mobility. And the third are digital solutions. So staff are looking at potential projects for this funding program. And the deadline is the 9th of March. So we're actively working on this, and we'll keep council informed. The second one, equally exciting, is called the Provincial Municipal Modernization Funding. You may recall there was a round last year for modernization. There's another round open now. It closes on the 15th. It's cost shared. The province will fund up to 75% of project costs. So we've gone through the criteria, and again, we're shortlisting projects that we think would fit. As a general guidance, we're looking at projects that are either in our budget this year or are at least in our strategic plan. So there is some alignment, and we think that'll strengthen the application because it shows, shows alignment. So we're working on that. As I said, March 15th is the deadline for that one, and they're able to help assist in projects between 20,000 and 250,000. So significant amounts of money. and we'll keep council posted as we move forward with each of those funding projects. Thank you.
Any questions? Thanks for that. And thank you to staff for identifying opportunities because they're there. And we want to thank the upper tier for providing those opportunities to municipalities because we need it. Okay, so we have two correspondence items. The one is an information package we received from Galbraith and Associates, which details a wireless antenna that's going in on Highway 29. It's not in the municipality, so I guess that's an information piece. But it's good to see that you know they're improving wireless and broadband in the rural. If there's any questions, yeah, Councillor Alford.
Not a question, but if we have an opportunity to reply to this, can you tell them to get our name right on the maps? It's Smiths Falls, not Smith. One of my pet peeves.
Okie dokie. Councillor Allen.
Yeah, this may not be a smart question because I don't know much about how broadband works, but will it affect, will the quality of our internet service change? Is it going to be affected by that, or are they just will it just affect the region that they're putting them in?
Councillor McGuire can answer that maybe.
High school is going to be able to upload an exponential number of TikToks after the tower goes in. It's a cell tower that's going to increase the amount of bandwidth of data that can get transferred from cell phones. So I would assume the high school is a pretty big user.
That's what I was being. Yeah, I wondered. That's great. Good news.
Good. Thanks for that. The other piece we had was the resolution that the County of Lanark passed to recognize the efforts of our health unit to protect the community. And I would suggest maybe we put this on for ourselves to do a similar resolution at a future meeting. Absolutely. Yeah. Okay. So we have no in-camera items. The first priority issue tonight is Bellamy Farm. Councillor McGuire?
Yeah, Mr. Chair, I was wondering with the time we're going on tonight, if we would defer item 8.5 parking bylaw updates report for a future meeting.
Okay, any comments? Anybody have a problem with that? Councillor Alford?
Yeah, I don't have a problem with it. Just there's some things in there that we haven't talked anywhere in that bylaw about bikes and parking and how that might impact our downtown. So maybe we should defer it for a little longer.
Okay. Staff have any concerns about deferring it for now? None? Everything's okay with that? All right, so that's a late deferral there. So we'll defer that one, and we'll get into the Bellamy Farm subdivision phase 2 and 3 report from our senior planner Grenke. And there he is.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Good evening, everyone. I'm bringing for council's discussion an update on the Bellamy Farm subdivision and an issues and options report seeking your direction on a few key items. So this will help inform some of the conditions of draft approval, which we will be bringing forward for council's consideration in a later report once that's ready. As council is aware, the first iteration of Bellamy Farm was originally draft approved in 2013, extended twice with final approval ultimately given for phase 1, which is getting built out, but lapsing for the remainder of the subdivision. The developers, Parkview Homes, have then reapplied for essentially the same subdivision for the subsequent phases. And while we held the statutory public meeting for that in late 2019, they found shortly thereafter that market conditions were changing and there seemed to be a lot more interest in the townhouse model than what was originally presumed when this came forward. So Parkview used this opportunity to refine the proposal and make it what they want to see today. And to that end, they filed a revised application with several key changes, and that's what we've been working on with them over the last while. So just to summarize some of the key points, and for those viewing at home, the overall number of units in this phase would increase from from 194 to 251, and that basically involves the replacing of single detached homes throughout the subdivision, especially in the eastern part of the subdivision with the townhomes. So the intended mix is now a total of 186 townhouse units, 10 semi-detached units, and 54 single units. So block 103, which is a wetland block at the southeast corner of the site, is now proposed to be enlarged to include lands for a dedicated park. And also a proposed parkette is featured at the south end, or sorry, the north end of the subdivision, facing the Cataraqui Trail. So we'll details. So we're also working with on certain pathway links as well. So the collector road going through the site is proposed to be widened a little bit. So some of the technical work done to support the previous concept was still valid, but much of it did, of course, need to be updated to follow the passage of time and also accommodate the additional units. So Parkview worked closely with town staff over the last number of months on updating the work, and they continue to work on some aspects. And I'd like to acknowledge particularly the efforts of RVCA and the Public Works Department in their approach and the work they've done on the technical and engineering details. So the public meeting in December had relatively limited interest, with one household participating virtually and another not participating in the meeting, but engaging us extensively through the process with some very helpful and constructive feedback regarding parkland, open space, and density. And certainly I appreciate the efforts there very much. So broadly speaking, we can speculate that one reason there is perhaps less public interest than we might expect is because the idea of a subdivision at that location is not new. It's been around for a while, and I think most people in Ferreira Meadows, right next door, were aware that residential development would be coming down the pipeline. So just to confirm, the report is not seeking draft approval at this stage. There's still some work to do, but staff are looking to confirm council's direction on a few key points, and that direction will help inform the draft approval conditions for when those are ready to come forward. So before I get into the next section of the report, I'll look to the chair to confirm if you'd like to go through these one by one, or proceed through the entire report now and discuss afterwards.
I'll take committee's direction on that. Councillor Dwyer.
Thanks. I think Carl's suggestion to go through point by point is probably a valid one. There's quite a few very specific questions, and I think the rest of the report is mostly generalities. So I think it's wise to do it point by point.
Okay, I'm fine with that. Anybody else? Councillor McGuire? Thumbs up. Okay. Off you go.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So phasing, I'll just quickly highlight the phasing plan. I don't need direction on this particular point, but just for your information, the first phase of the new subdivision is Parkview's identified it as phase 2, recognizing that phase 1 already underway. And that takes into account the extension of Staples Boulevard and the lands to the east of that. And that phase will consist entirely of townhouse development. That's the one they want to get started on as soon as they can. The next phase will come later and will include more of the single detached dwellings, and they're less set on sticking with the exact layout identified on the draft plan. And indeed, staff and the developers have agreed in principle on some modifications, which I'll get to a bit later. But they're hoping that draft approval will set the stage for the work on the earlier phase, while allowing some final tweaks to the subsequent phase. The biggest change with this subdivision is the increase in density, and this was carefully considered in the planning rationale that Parkview's agent submitted, and in my opinion is broadly supported in policy that supports a greater range of housing types to create a more complete and inclusive community. So the density at this point has not been found to be problematic from a traffic management or servicing approach. So staff are okay with that. But I think one of the key points is and the question is how and where that density should be managed, and that's a good question. So with the change in plan from singles to townhouses along the eastern U Street that runs parallel to the backyards of Code and Lee residences, there have been some concerns about visual impact, especially given that some fairly tall townhouses being constructed along Ferreira. So Parkview has indicated that the townhouses along this block would be single-story bungalow style. With the gas line running along there, these yards are actually, these blocks are a lot deeper. So they're about 42.5 meters, 139 feet, which is much deeper than the 98 feet that the new townhouse lots on Ferreira. So I think in this case, the concerns about the visual compatibility are a good one, and staff seek council's concurrence on how that should be managed. So one option could be to direct that these blocks of townhomes are reverted to singles. Staff and the Planning Advisory Committee recognize that a compromise option where a height limit of 1 story accompanied by significantly increased rear yard setbacks would allow for a much reduced visual impact on these neighbors. And the developers are amenable to pursuing a site-specific zoning to implement this as a condition of draft approval. So I'll look for council's direction on the 3 options presented there.
Okay, Councillor Allen.
Yeah, if I could just ask a question, Carl. The first question I have was, what was the evidence? Like, this report talks about how they say the market value showed that more people wanted townhouses. What stats, or how did they come up with that idea?
Go ahead, Carl.
So I think I can follow up with Parkview specifically on that, but from what I've been from what they've advised me, they haven't provided me specific data other than simply the sales and the interest that they've been receiving from the buyers of the townhomes. I think it's exceeded what they've been what they were expecting when they first launched those projects.
Well, it's just my opinion. I liked it better when we had a mixed use. We had singles, and now it's going to be, if I'm reading this right, no singles. The final phase 2 is going to be just townhouses, or much fewer. And I went over there this week a couple times, or last week, I should say, and I really think the neighborhood, the variety of types of homes there makes it a better neighborhood. I think a neighborhood of all row houses or townhouses is going to look and feel different than that. And I mean, I go into the city, or I go to larger places where there's just long neighborhoods of row houses, and you just don't have the same sense of community that you have when you have mixed housing units. That's my own thought. I'll just leave it at that.
Thanks for that. Any comment, Carl? Or
no, I think that's certainly a fair point. At this point, Parkview's advanced a proposal that they feel it makes economic sense. And yes, you are correct, Councillor, that the first part of this 2-phase subdivision extension is entirely proposed to be townhomes, but they are proposing on the other side, facing more of the wetland areas, they are proposing more single detached dwellings. So this is certainly a style of development that's different from the historical development patterns in the town of Smith Falls, and certainly when looking at this subdivision, along with, in conjunction with the Maple Ridge that's entirely singles just to the north, we're looking at roughly half of these new lots that are being draft approved at this time being something higher than single detached, at a higher density than single detached dwelling. So that's certainly a higher density than our historic patterns have been, and in time we certainly want to have a look and make sure that our planning policy support I guess what the market looks for as well.
okay, thank you. Mayor Penko, did you have it? Yeah,
sure. Yeah, I support the recommendation and what the Planning Advisory Committee has recommended, and again, having bungalow style townhomes there, I think will be appropriate. I'm fine with the density. I guess the other part, of course, is affordability, and the townhomes are a more affordable form of home construction, and I guess we're trying to make sure that we can get our
our people into the homeowners market. And I think it's going to be a great entry point for a lot of people. Or at the other end of the spectrum, opportunity for people who want to retire to have something they can downsize to.
Thank you, Councillor Dwyer.
Thank you. I actually disagree with option one. I think it's a very, very slippery slope to go down. This would be the only case where we've restricted development in town, period, to single-story dwellings. The maximum height across all of our zones is fixed at 11 meters. What you do with that is up to you. I think judging the site parameters around here, I mean, the grade already significantly drops off into the site. Then you do have the Enbridge easement there. So by the time you space these dwellings out away from the Enbridge easement plus a rear yard, that should be sufficient setback from townhomes to the existing uses. I think once we give once on resident requests to reduce the height, you're going to run into that example everywhere, and I don't think that that's something that we want to do. And I don't think in this case there's been sufficient enough justification to demonstrate why there's an adverse impact created by that height. The staff report doesn't include anything about shadowing impact on these neighborhoods. There's no view shed assessment to show what views from these residents would be into a rear yard with a 6-foot high fence. Based on the information that is being presented right now, I'm not comfortable with this because I think it's something that once we give on once, it's going to come back again and again and again. I appreciate the fact that that Parkview has indicated that they're comfortable establishing these lots as bungalows, and if that's the case, then I think that's fine. And it's wise for Parkview to agree to that, to quell concerns from neighbors adjacent, but I think it's wrong to put that into land use policy that the expectation will be to duplicate elsewhere. So for that reason, I suggest option 2, which I think is kind of that meeting in the middle. It gives Parkview the go-ahead for the townhomes. I believe, Carl, can you clarify? Does it give townhomes on those blocks or no? Option 2.
Just going into that report.
Read it to you.
Sorry, so maybe just to clarify while Carl finds it, my sense is that it's okay to if Parkview wants townhomes backing onto these lots, I'm fine with that. I think you look for an enhanced rear yard setback if needed, but I think there needs to be more justification if we're going to drop the maximum height on these lots. That's my thoughts.
Go ahead, Carl.
Yes, so option 3 is to support the plan as is and do not regulate the size of. So if council supports option 3, then we'd be supporting townhouse development along that rear lot line with or without a rear yard setback increase. The rear yard setback would be increased by way of the easement anyway, but option 3 would be the townhouse block. Option 2 would be requiring modifying the plan to accommodate singles along that block.
Thanks, Carl. So maybe just to clarify, quite frankly, I don't like any of those options. I think I'm looking for kind of a hybrid option, not to complicate matters, but that's my 2 cents and what council chooses to do. I mean, we'll go with the majority.
Councillor Brennan, I believe your microphone's off.
Me bad. Councillor McKenna, sorry.
I appreciate Councillor Dwyer's comments and tend to agree with, not tend to, I do agree with her. I'm pleased with the increasing the density through more townhouse development in the subdivision and support that. And I think there wasn't, as Councillor Dwyer pointed out, there wasn't a large backlash. It was a one or two residents' opinion that they would like to see it less height. So I'm comfortable, and as she said, well, I'll stop there. I agree with her and agree with the density and with more townhouses in that community. Thank you.
Thanks for that. Anybody else? Councillor Alfred, do you have your hand up? Yep.
Yeah, I struggle a bit with this only because I don't want to hamper the developer's plan. If he has seen a market change since he originally did this and he thinks townhomes would work better there, then I don't necessarily want to stand in the way of that. And yet our discussions at Planning Advisory were to have a more gentle transition than single family dwellings in these blocks from 97 to 102. So I know, given the discussions we had at Planning Advisory and not wanting to impede the ability of the developer to respond to his market research or his economic considerations, I'm going to support staff's recommendation for the single story townhouses in the block 97 and 102, which is where we ultimately got to at the Planning Advisory Committee. So although I do agree with some of the comments that Councillor Dwyer made, where possible, I think we can and should consider what that will do from the neighborhood, whether we hear from the neighbors or not, which is what we did at Planning Advisory. We thought about how that would transition that neighborhood. So I'm going to support staff's recommendation on option 1 for the first of these several other items.
Councillor McGuire.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I think Councillor Dwyer brings up a lot of good points that I also agree with. I'm wondering, are you suggesting that we defer to get more information on the points you brought up, or to make a decision tonight?
Through the chair,
Go ahead.
I put the points out for discussion. I mean, if council is agreeable to the staff recommendation, and who am I to stand in the way of that? I don't think, reading Carl's report, I don't think that this is something that's going to lead to conclusive decisions with Parkview tonight. Carl's just looking for direction. And then ultimately, whether or not we abide by the same sort of path of thinking by the time we get to an approval for draft conditions, I think there's still some time for us to work that out. Carl, I mean, was there any, besides public feedback, was there any legitimate land use planning justification for why a reduction in the height on these lots was being considered?
Go ahead, Carl.
Yeah, it was simply a matter of looking at the transition between built forms, more of a medium or higher density form of development with a larger height next to or behind lower density housing. But certainly this isn't the only. There's other communities where there is that mix of housing in there, and I'm happy to take. I think that was the proposal there was presented as really a compromise to sort of balance the interests of the community with the and accommodate what the developer was willing to do in that particular instance. As a new subdivision, we have the opportunity. I certainly take your point about at what point do we want to set a precedent. So I think if option 3 is supported, then certainly or I guess a hybrid option 3 is supported. I'll also take council's direction as even if we're okay not regulating the height in this case, I'll take council's direction as to whether we want to see an enhanced rear yard setback or whether you feel that's necessary. But as Councillor Dwyer indicated, I am just looking for direction at this point as to what council wants to see. Obviously, this will come back to council later on for draft approval when we're ready for that.
Okay, thank you. Any other? I mean, Councillor Alpha and we went through this at the planning committee a couple times, and I'm gonna support staff recommendation because I mean we heard from neighbor and the developer was always you know, amenable to do what they could. Also, I'd point out that this also has a park component, and it has a link to the Cataraqui Trail, which they put in as well. So I'd like to see this go forward. Councillor Dwyer.
Sorry, just a point of clarity. Could you perhaps do a straw vote to see if Carl has clear direction?
Sure.
here?
Yep, straw vote. So in favor of staff recommendation on this. Don't have it. Councillor Dwyer?
May I suggest that perhaps we put this one aside and we'll move on to the rest, and then that'll give Carl some time to think about how he'd like to pivot on this, because if we're deadlocked right now, then I mean, the motion's not going to die on the floor because we're not in council, but I mean, it's problematic.
Yeah, we could come back to it. Absolutely. Carl, are you okay with that?
Sure.
Okay.
All right, so moving on, with respect to wetlands and natural features, I don't require direction from council at this stage. What the developers have been working on with RVCA in the greatest detail over the last while is finalizing the details of the wetland compensation necessitated by the widening of Broadview. Once ready, we anticipate that RVCA would provide us draft approval conditions, and then they would be a clearance agency on that. So we would also propose the appropriate landscaping and tree planting provisions as conditions of draft approval as guided by the new tree canopy preservation and enhancement policy. So the increase in density necessitated a closer look at servicing and infrastructure. The Public Works Department is advised they're satisfied with the information provided in the serviceability report. However, they recommend a couple of items be addressed as conditions of draft approval. Stormwater management is more complicated in light of the increase in density, while engineering work is ongoing. In the opinion of both the Public Works Department and RVCA, there has not been enough information so far to demonstrate how additional runoff will be mitigated. So we do rely on the advice of these agencies on this matter, and they advise that while the applicable sections of the PPS relating to stormwater management likely can be satisfied to this proposal, they're not yet there. And when they are, they will be recommended. They will recommend draft approval conditions for council's consideration, which we will bring forward. So that is something that is ongoing. The engineers are working on that at this point, and plans are being sent back and forth and being commented. So the other, in terms of transportation, one important component is the inclusion of that second access, which would take place through the upgrading and widening of Broadview Avenue, and that would spread traffic impacts from the subdivision and likely reduce the overall traffic up and down Herald. Sidewalks would go on one side of each of the streets, and bike lanes on both sides of proposed collector extensions, being Broadview and Staples. One modification proposed by staff and agreed to by Parkview was to link the two cul-de-sac local streets at the far end of the subdivision to improve emergency access, snow plowing, and maintenance. So I will look for council's concurrence on whether they're okay with that change, and then also for any questions that council may have regarding the anything related to servicing or infrastructure, stormwater.
Questions, comments, Councillor Dwyer?
I think it's fantastic, and this one I will support. For context, we actually asked for this in the original plan of subdivision, so I am relieved to see that Parkview has come around and has accepted this as a recommendation. So, hallelujah! Thank you, Carl. It'll definitely improve the transportation flow and servicing within the subdivision.
Okay, everyone's thumbs up, nodding heads. Good. Go ahead.
The next section is one that's been discussed a lot with Parkview and also around the PAC8 table, and that's parkland and amenity space. So the Planning Act allows municipalities to take parkland as a part of subdivision approval, representing 5% of the area of land. And this land has to be useful land. It can't be wetlands, stormwater facilities, and the like. So the previous proposal had the town taking what came forward in 2019 was that the town taking cash in lieu of parkland, which is the other option under the Planning Act. However, with the Parkview's proposed increase in density, it gave our office the opportunity to revisit the issue. And in this case, the developer identified and agreed with the value to his community in providing parkland space. So we agree that this is especially important given a predominantly townhouse development allows relatively little space, little yard space for residents. The subdivision is also surrounded by some significant natural areas, and the developer's decision to propose parkland will further allow them to integrate this community within that setting. So this is the end of the line as far as development at this end of the town goes. There will be no future subdivisions to the south and west of these lands, so these green spaces would remain so in perpetuity. The current plan proposes 2 parks. The larger one that's part of the initial phase of the subdivision, that's part of Block 103. This block includes wetlands. However, about 1.12 hectares, or roughly 2.5 acres of land, was identified outside the wetland. Taking into account a proposed 20-meter wetland buffer that's going to have to remain largely protected, that would leave a space of about 40 or so meters at its deepest, which allows for a parkland development, much of which would front directly on one of the proposed streets. Some of this land was previously assigned and zoned for residential development, so it would need to be rezoned. So while we don't know for sure what the park would look like, at this point, we're just trying to identify the lands and confirm, firstly, council's direction on parkland. We feel this location is fairly accessible within a block or 2 of the majority of this phase of the subdivision. And there's also the potential for natural harmony given the location close to the wetland feature. But we will need to work carefully in design, and certainly the Parks and Recreation Master Plan that's undergoing will be helpful in that regard. We've also identified the potential for a pathway connection between this subdivision along or beside the gas easement to connect to a widened Broadview in order to provide pedestrian and cyclist connections for more amenities. We understand that Enbridge and RVCA are open to a relatively low impact path at this vicinity. However, of course, more work and external approvals will need to be done. In the next phase, a small parkette has been proposed linking to the Cataraqui Trail. This park is pretty small at about 6,500 square feet, but it is helpful at the other end of the subdivision to provide access to some green space. Parkview is open to enlarging the space by expanding into neighboring lots, provided the overall number of units in the phase is not reduced through tweaks elsewhere. This would bring the park size closer to the target for a local park identified in the OP. The non-wetland open space is currently presented as roughly 7% of the subdivision lands. However, some of that's within 20%, within the 20-meter buffer associated with Block 103. So less than that amount would be usable as open parkland. Staff and the developers have also explored the idea of trails within and around the subdivision. So trails development around natural areas is specifically supported in the official plan for its economic, recreation, and educational value. So the western end of the subdivision is going to feature a stormwater retention area as well as a wetland compensation project. Staff and Parkview have identified the opportunity to create a potential linkage along these rear yards to the Cataraqui Trail. In order to ensure connectivity, the 2 stormwater easements can be made into blocks conveyed to the town that would then be designed to provide trail access from the subdivision. So this is all very aspirational at this stage. There's a lot of detail, a lot of design work, and we'd still need to confirm some technical feasibility. Parkview has agreed to include a reference to these within the draft approval conditions, and that would have the broader benefit of making more of a community asset out of the functional stormwater retention area. So while the upcoming Parks and Recreation Master Plan and active transportation work will help us more strategically define our priorities, we feel that now is the time to identify these opportunities and make them available. If we miss them now, then it would be a lot harder to work it into a plan in the future. And I'd like to give a lot of credit to Parkview here for their work and their openness in enhancing their plan with community open space. And I'm very pleased to bring this section forward to Council. Firstly, I'd like to confirm Council's preference for dedicating parkland as part of the subdivision approval. And secondly, I'd like to seek Council's direction on 3 items to be associated with the next phase, which they have identified as phase 3. So one, the final subdivision plan for phase 3 will be modified to show a larger parkland area associated with block 61. And then that fabric can be modified such that there be no net change for the number of units in the space. And that can probably happen by making some of the other lots a little bit smaller. Also, the identified storm easements in phase 3 connecting to block 60 can be dedicated to the town as blocks for a future for a potential future trail connection, and also that the stormwater infrastructure proposed along block 60 be designed with regard to the creation of recreational opportunities such as trails. And that, of course, is something that would need to be fleshed out to a great extent in the future, but this would have the opportunity to at least identify that. And Parkview has confirmed that they're in agreement with these recommendations. So I'll seek council's direction on these points.
Thanks, Carl. Mayor Panko.
Carl, I'm very pleased to see this. I go back to 2013. I was really disappointed with the outcome of having really no park space in an area where we would have hundreds of people living. And you've done an incredible job of working with Parkview to come up with, I think, a really, really meaningful differences. I support everything you've outlined here. I believe the more green space we have in here, the more trails and more connections and more access to the cat trail, more opportunities for outdoor recreation, especially in areas of higher density. We end up with a complete community. And so I'm really pleased with the outcome of this, and I think it's going to be a great place for people to live. So congratulations, and thanks to Parkview for seeing their way on this and creating something I think everyone will be very pleased with.
Thank you for that. Councillor Dwyer.
Thank you. Just point of clarity. Carl, is the intent to just have Parkview convey the land in a clean and green state, or are they going to be making improvements, say fencing it off from other adjacent private lands, putting in granular trail base, something like that, or is it truly just a land conveyance?
Go ahead, Carl.
No, good question. At this point, for phase 3, we would be we're looking at it as a land conveyance at this point. However, with council's direction, I can certainly work out. I can explore some of these other details with the developers if council would like to see that.
Okay, Councillor McKenna.
I support the staff recommendation as well, and Mr. Granke, you mentioned earlier that you're following with interest, as we all are, the Parks and Rec master plan, and that may indeed inform how this particular site could or should be further enhanced. And there may be time to do that with the plan, I'm not sure.
Yeah. Right. Carl?
Yeah, so one thing that I'm through the chair, Mr. Chair, one thing I am looking forward to coming out of the Parks and Recreation master plan is exploring some of the tools that we have available and can have available to sort of give us the more leverage to request these and to fund these sorts of improvements here and throughout the town in the future when we're looking at development like this.
Okay, everyone's okay with this? Thumbs up. Yes, good. Okay, so that's it, eh, Carl?
Okay.
Yeah.
So
the one point we had the stickling point on, we'll have to come back and revisit.
Oh, no, I have.
Yeah, okay, you get another one.
Sorry. The final item on this, or I guess the next item on this list, which I seek council's direction, is how our process will address the letter sent to us last July by the Algonquins of Ontario. So the letter received in late July 2020 was a response to the notice of public meeting we issued for the previous iteration of the plan in November 2019. The letter identified an interest in being involved in the review of any archaeological work in the subdivision, although my reading was not able to determine areas of specific and individual concern to these Bellamy Farm lands. And this was probably the most difficult section on this report for me to write, since there are several different thoughts on what the right approach is. So on the one hand, we know the developers are eager for a decision on the application. They've been working away at this for quite a while. And on the other hand, I still don't know the desired approach from the Algonquins of Ontario, and have not received that information despite several outreaches having been made in terms of their particular interest in exploring the next steps. So the PPS policies highlighting the importance of meaningful and genuine consultation are in place for a reason. And while the Planning Act and PPS do not give a specific direction that would direct a next step, staff are confident that we have been diligent and proactive in outreach through this process as directed by the PPS, and also as the right thing to do. So in my latest correspondence to the AO in late January, I advised that their letter would be placed on a council agenda for discussion and direction. And before we proceed to the next steps, I would seek council's direction. So the first of the three options we see at this point are simply to move forward to draft approval when we're ready. So in the event that new information does come forward from the AOO or from someone else that necessitates a course change, the Planning Act does allow us to modify draft approval conditions, and that can be a conversation at that point with everybody. Alternatively, we can insert a draft approval condition that requires the production of an archaeological assessment to provincial standards and subject to the review of the AOO. That cost we expect would be passed on to Parkview, and the costs and potential additional timelines would likely not be welcomed by the developers. And this also has not specifically been, well, this is an option that's sort of guessing a solution. We haven't been asked to do this by anybody. Alternatively, we can delay the approval until we have a path forward defined by the Algonquins of Ontario and the town. And while we can do that, also, I should note that none of the parties have made that request to me as well. And of course, I'm not, unfortunately, in position to offer a forecast on when that can be completed if we went that route. But at this point, we have received this request. Unfortunately, I don't have additional information to give or correspondence. We have reached out, but I will look for council's direction on what our next steps are with respect to the letter. And if council does require additional information prior to providing direction on this point, I will certainly endeavor to obtain that as well.
Thanks, Carl. I forgot about that point. Any comments, questions? Councillor Dwyer?
Yeah, so I think if the Algonquins have asked for more information, notably an archaeological assessment, as they do in paragraph 1, then we have a duty to ensure that that gets done. I think the Ontario Heritage Act is also pretty clear that while there's site-specific criteria that you consider, i.e. 500 meters from a waterway, the archaeological assessment is required. The very last item on that list is an expressed interest from a First Nations community. So as soon as you get the expressed interest from a First Nations community, there's a duty by the local municipality to have reference to that and to conduct the archaeological assessment. So the OHA has changed many times over the last 7 years since this plan was approved. But I think the fact that the Algonquins are noting an expressed interest in this it should be reason enough to have the archaeological assessment done. Now, whether or not it's done now or at times of draft approval, my sense is now, because if the findings of the archaeological assessment have reason for the Algonquins to appeal, I think we should preserve their appeal rights. Once you pass the draft conditions of approval on the subdivision, there is no longer an appeal mechanism under the Act. So my sense is that for the sake of the time that it's going to take to do this, there's an onus on us to take a pause and make sure that the archaeological due diligence is completed.
Councillor Alfred?
From the letter that we received from the Algonquins of Ontario, it doesn't necessarily say that they're going to carry out an archaeological undertaking. They're not going to undertake in that particular place. It more and because Carl hasn't been able to have the conversation with them as to what exactly it is they're looking for, I'm not saying that we shouldn't go ahead. Councillor Dwyer makes some good points, but we haven't had much engagement from them to be able to determine what it is we're looking for. We do know from experience in archaeological digs that the Rideau was more a trade and travel route. It was not a settlement area for the Algonquins or any Indigenous people. It closer to Ottawa, certainly, but there's been no evidence of settlement along the Rideau, and this isn't even along the river. So I'm not adverse to doing it, but I would like some more information from the Algonquins. Should they be able to supply for us what they would, how they would foresee this moving forward. And unfortunately, they haven't, from what I understand, they haven't engaged in letting us know exactly what their expectation is. So if anything, if we're going to we're not granting draft approval tonight. There is some time to potentially engage them some more, or we still have to go back to our first point that we're going to consider here. So I'm not in any great rush to say no to it, but right now I'm not in any great rush to say yes to it either. I'd really love the Algonquins of Ontario to give us some more insight before we decide this.
Okay, thank you. Any other comments? Seeing none. Yeah, I don't think, I agree with Councillor Dwyer. I mean, if there's due diligence to be done, then it should be done. My question would be, did this happen? I don't recall it happening in around 2013 when we did that other phase. Does anybody remember? Councillor Dwyer? It did?
No, it did not. I believe if Carl goes back to check the consultation records, while we would have canvassed both the Métis and the Algonquin First Nation in the area, I do not believe that we got comments back.
So there was no uptake at that time?
No, however, I will say that the Algonquins have, in more recent years, as part of their land claim and territory in the area, become much more organized and participatory in planning applications. They've actually retained a registered professional planner to work on their behalf. So it's becoming more and more common for these comments to come in.
Okay, thanks. Any other comments? I think that you know, I don't think this is a showstopper tonight, from what I see, and I don't know if Carl, if you got enough direction from us or not.
So
yeah.
So the direction I'm hearing from council, or that I'm taking at this point, and if you can confirm it, Mr. Chair, is that that council would like to see me outreach further towards further to the AOO and try again and get feedback, but this may be something I report back to you fairly quickly on in terms of defining the archaeological requirements. If that is a requirement that if council is going to be looking for that, then ideally I'd certainly like to confirm that with Parkview Homes first, and certainly or confirm that with Parkview Homes afterwards, and hopefully a conversation with the AOO beforehand. So I'll just look for council's direction on the next steps on this point.
Okay, so everyone okay with Carl reaching out, getting more info? Okay. Okay, we're good there, Carl?
Thank you. Sorry, Matt, Mr. Chair,
Nikki?
if I may, if perhaps we cannot get an opinion from OAA, perhaps as a substitute, we could get a written opinion from the Ministry of Culture, Tourism and Sport, who manages the Ontario Heritage Act and requirements for archaeological assessments. I mean, the opinion coming from the AOO would be much better. But failing that, perhaps we could get a ministry take on whether or not we have satisfied the requirements.
Carl, you're okay with that?
Certainly, I can.
Okay.
I can reach out.
Okay. So clear as mud, I guess. We're gonna go forward. We had one stickling point at the start there, so we'll have to hear back from you. Yeah, Carl.
So if I can just jump back to that, or did we want to give just to clarify on that point right now? The sense I get from council is that the council is supportive of townhouse development along that block. The only question is, to what extent do we want to regulate that? So I guess either options one or option one or option three, or perhaps some hybrid thereof.
I think I was option one. Councillor Alfred was option one. Hands up. Okay.
Can I just make a
Is
comment?
that? Oh yeah, sure. Go ahead.
I will, because we're estimated, but I still think the single units were a better idea, but I would prefer that than the other one, so I will go with that one.
Councillor McKenna.
Yeah, I think that the point that Councillor Dwyer made, if I understood it correctly, was it just we didn't want to impose it and set a precedent. It's going to happen anyways. The developer wants to lower the height. The neighbors will be happy. Everybody will be happy. That's all we're doing. So that was the only deviation from the recommendation that I understood, and I was supportive of that.
Okay. Councillor Dwyer.
Yeah, I thank you, Councillor McKenna. That's exactly my point. I would personally even be more comfortable with stipulating it as a condition in the subdivision agreement rather than specifically zoning it in the zoning bylaw. My fear is that once it's in the zoning bylaw, the expectation will be that it is duplicated elsewhere, and that's my concern. If Parkview is agreeable to single family homes, quite frankly, it may even help their saleability there, then great, but do not put it in the zoning bylaw.
Councillor McGuire.
Would there be any consensus to say, it's great work from the Planning Advisory Committee, great work from the developer and the residents, for everybody coming together and coming up with a mutually agreeable solution, but that's as far as we can endorse and just leave it at that, or do we need to go all the way?
Carl, any comment on that?
So I think we will be, once this subdivision comes back, assuming when it comes back for draft approval, the draft approval will include a whole range of conditions. So I think that at this point, one of the conditions can be that the subdivision agreement reference the form of development along that block, or alternatively, the subdivision, the condition can state that the applicant shall rezone to do X, Y, Z, whatever we require. So council does have the say in this, and council's direction would be implemented in a site as a draft approval condition.
Okay, so I mean, this went through planning, and there was concern about the height of the townhomes facing back to the single, and I thought Parkview made accommodations for that, and I thought it was, well done. So isn't that what we're agreeing to? Like, we're getting so late here, my brain's sorry. Is that what we're agreeing to? C.O. Morris, save me.
So if I may, Mr. Chair, I think the issue at hand here is whether you want to set a precedent by enshrining this in zoning. So I think there's merit in not doing that if we can achieve what the developer wants to achieve without setting a dangerous precedent, then perhaps a condition of approval is a better avenue than enshrining it in zoning. I think everyone's aligned on what needs to be done, and if you can do that without setting a precedent, that's the best approach. So I guess my question for Carl is more planning. Can this be accomplished through a condition?
I will verify with the chief building official to confirm that a provision here is satisfactory under applicable law for the issuance of a building permit. But certainly, if that's the direction of council, and provided that we can accommodate this as an agreement condition, as that's applicable law, then I can bring I'll bring that wording back. If we can't, I can certainly go the zoning route. But I can explore the subdivision agreement and approach with my CBO.
There, and it's a win-win then, right? Win-win.
Exactly.
Okay. Thanks, Carl. You have your directions? Yes. Okay.
Thank you.
We'll move on. Okay, so the next item, and I was going to try to get rid of this, but I think we'd be in trouble if we did. The 2021 temporary borrowing bylaw report with Treasurer Koziel. We need to do this.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Excuse me, I'm here this evening seeking council's approval for a temporary borrowing bylaw. This annual bylaw is for the town's line of credit should the need arise to borrow short-term during 2021. In the event that it is required, council would be advised prior to doing so. It's important to note that this is not anticipated, but it is recommended for unforeseen circumstances.
Okay, any questions? We need to stay solvent. And so that'll come forward at the next available council meeting. I would take it. Yes, okay. So thanks for hanging in there for that. Now we've deferred or moved the 8.3, and we'll have that at 8.6. So with CO Morris, but the next one is the Housing Advisory Committee terms of reference with Director Costello.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I bring forward this evening a report, which is an outcome of the housing report that Council adopted in late 2020. Recommendation number 17 in that report was that a housing advisory committee be struck to oversee and assist in coordinating the fulfillment and implementation of all 17 of the recommendations that were found within that housing report. So what you have before you this evening is a draft terms of reference for the Housing Advisory Committee. It's set up very similar to our housing task force. The scope of work for this group would be to review the housing report and all 17 recommendations contained in it, to review applicable Smiths Falls policies, such as our official plan and zoning bylaw provisions, establish a process to engage and consult the public in matters related to housing, act as a commenting body to review new and updated bylaws and policies, as well as assist staff in fulfilling all the 17 recommendations in the housing report. So I bring that forward this evening for council's review. If council accepts the terms of reference, we can start advertising for membership on the committee. As you'll see, the membership consists of the mayor or designate, as well as one council member, a member from the Planning Advisory Committee, which I think was a recommendation from Councillor McGuire, if I'm not mistaken, back when we talked about the housing report, a landlord or property manager, a developer, builder, realtor, representative from the Seniors Committee, a tenant, and a member of the community. The staff resource for this committee will be Manager of Economic Development Tourism, Jennifer Miller. And the rest is set up, as I said, very similar to our previous task force. So if council has any questions or any comments regarding the draft terms of reference, I'd be happy to take those.
Councillor McKenna.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'm supportive of the terms of reference. I did have a question at the bottom of page 1 on the deliverables. It says that we'll present the final report no later than September 2022 that addresses the completion of all 17 recommendations. It implies that they're going to actually complete and do all 17, which is very ambitious. And some of those things may or may not be within the control of the committee. I just wonder if it shouldn't say that it just implies that they're going to do all 17. It just seems a bit strong. I think, should we make every effort to complete them or report back on the progress on all 17? Or that's a big task.
Nope.
Okay.
Nope, thank you for that comment. And you brought up another point, Councillor McKenna, thank you. We did provide that the report would be presented to all of you in September 22 because we wanted this complete before the end of the 2022 term of council. So that's why that date was picked. But Councillor McKenna, thank you. I understand what you're saying and we can reword that so it's not of the strong.
Thank you, Councillor Alfred.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. With regard to the voting members, I know we oftentimes have difficulty finding enough to flesh out some of these committees. And I wonder if some of these can do double duty. So if in a landlord property manager could also be a developer builder. So we don't have to have that many individuals sometimes that they can serve that role on the committee. They can serve multiple roles on the committee as to what you've listed out here.
Certainly with the concurrence of council, if they wanted to, reevaluate the voting members, we could put an upset limit of so many members, but maybe give preference to people from these areas of expertise.
Well, if you have 2 members of the housing task force, I can think of both a developer and a realtor that were on that.
Mhm.
So if you could get those 2 housing task force members to be on it, you filled 4 spots, 4 people.
Mhm. No, great point. And I realized when we did the membership drive for the task force, we did have incidents where that happened and we were able to rejig the membership based on the number of people that submitted their name. We put somebody down as a community member.
Because 11 is a large committee.
Yep.
To manage. Just a thought anyways. I have no problem other than echoing what Councillor McKenna said. I have no problem with the terms of reference per se.
Okay.
Mayor Penko.
Yes, thanks, Carrie. The one thing that it may come through here anyway with people who may be part of the committee, but I think it's important we have insights from people who have lived experience or people who work with people who have that lived experience and from being housing insecure or precariously housed, people who have possibly been homeless. So that could come from community healthcare. They would have probably the ability to provide great insights or possibly Leonard County housing. But so I guess while it could be covered by a member of the community as well, or a tenant, or even a senior, of course. But I guess it's a matter, I want to make sure that we have those insights. The Housing Task Force as well, some of those members would have that experience. So maybe it doesn't have to be in here, but I want to make sure we do have that insight and that experience.
So as a reminder to council, all applications will be brought forward to you for review and for their official appointments. So maybe that's one way we can, when the applications come in, we can vet them that way.
Thank you.
To fulfill these different sectors.
Okay. Councillor Allen, you had your hand up?
Yeah, I'm under the voting members, Carrie. I thought, do you mean a developer / builder?
And or developer and or builder.
Yeah, it just says develop.
Yep,
Develop.
thank you. I'll make that change.
Okay, I think everyone's in agreement with the terms of reference, and we look forward to getting it started.
Thank you. We'll start advertising tomorrow.
Okay, sounds good. Thank you. So we've deferred the parking bylaw update for a later date, and we have one final item, and it's the Universal Broadband Fund application report, read letter of support, and CO Morris has this one.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chair. Recently, the mayor received a request from Bell to support an application they intend to make to the Universal Broadband Fund. It's a large pot of money that's meant to provide, encourage high-speed internet installations across the land. And so Bell wishes to apply, and they own the majority of the fiber network here in Smiths Falls. So they would like to continue with that fiber network. Now, upon asking further questions, we discovered that it would affect about 40 properties in Smiths Falls, so not a lot. That's good news because that tells us that the fiber network is fairly extensive in Smiths Falls, at least in the existing part of the town. But it would, I think, assist our neighbors. I know Rideau Lakes and Drummond North Elmsley and Montague all received, as did Merrickville Wolford, similar requests. So my recommendation is to support this because it's going to assist Smith Falls residents, but it's also going to improve service to our neighbors. And in the spirit of advancing our relationships with our neighbors, I would say we should support this.
I think you have complete agreement on that, and we're actually lucky in town that we have such good service, and we want our neighbors to have the same, and it brings us all together. So thanks for that, and we'll go ahead with the letter.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you. So I've come to the end. I'll entertain a motion for adjournment. Councillor Dwyer, second by Councillor McGuire, all in favor. The motion is the committee adjourns proceedings at 7:58 and so stand adjourned until the next duly called committee meeting. Councillor McKenna has his hand up. He's frozen.
Councillor McKenna's frozen. He's just